Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Haunting Plane of Kansas. It started with a question, one that, at first, seemed innocent enough. Ever seen the figures on the plane? It was a local guide who asked, his voice flat, as though it were a topic too familiar to bother with. Yet, the way his eyes narrowed and his lips pressed together suggested a story untold. He was a seasoned guide, someone who had seen countless tourists come and go, but this one question lingered in my mind long after I paid for my tour and set off toward the vast, empty stretch of land known as the Kansas Plain. I was a curious traveler, always seeking new experiences. The open wood of Kansas seemed like the perfect escape. Flat, desolate, almost hauntingly beautiful. The kind of place where you could get lost in the silence, where the wind whispered across the earth and nothing else seemed to matter. But something about that question, that one simple question, gnawed at me. The guide's words floated through my mind as I drove. I had expected the quiet solitude of the plain, the slow pace of life here, but the deeper I drove, the more I felt watched. It was subtle at first. A fleeting glance over my shoulder. The faintest shiver in the air. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but then, in the distance, I saw them. Figures. They stood still against the horizon, too far to be clearly made out, but there they were. Tall, humanoid shapes, motionless and unblinking. I slowed the car, my heart thumping in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the mirage of the heat, or perhaps a trick of the wind. But the longer I stared, the more it felt real. I parked the car at the side of the dusty road, and for a moment, I just sat there. The figures remained where they were, standing silently, their outlines faint but undeniable against the blue sky. There was something about them that didn't sit right. No one stood like that in the open, unmoving for so long. No one but the wind. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel, and started walking toward them. My steps were slow, cautious, as if I were approaching something unfamiliar, something dangerous. My eyes never left those figures. As I drew closer, a sense of unease crept up my spine. They were still there, standing motionless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air around me seemed to grow stiller, heavier. The usual sounds of the plain, the rustling of dry grass, the distant chirp of insects, faded away. The world felt too quiet, too empty. I called out to them, my voice echoing across the vast openness, but there was no response. Just the faint rustling of the wind. And then, as if in a blink, they were gone. I froze. One moment they were there, and the next, they had disappeared, vanishing into the thin, unbroken air. The only thing left behind was a strange, unsettling stillness, like the air had been sucked from the world. My pulse quickened, and my breath caught in my throat. The horizon was empty again, the plain stretched out in all directions, its vastness swallowing any sign of life. I stood there, staring at the spot where they had been, trying to make sense of it. I told myself I must have imagined it, a trick of the heat, perhaps, or the sun playing tricks with my eyes. But when I turned to head back to my car, my eyes caught something. Footprints. Faint, but there. They led away from the spot where the figures had stood, deep imprints in the dry earth, as though someone had walked there moments before. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought, but I couldn't ignore the chill creeping up my spine. The footprints, they were leading into the desert. Into the emptiness, as though someone had walked away into the nothingness, vanishing like the figures themselves. I couldn't explain it, but deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The shadows of doubt loomed over me as I climbed back into my car. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself that it was just an illusion, a strange occurrence in the vast emptiness of the plains. But the footsteps, those clear, undeniable footprints, seemed to follow me, lingering in my mind with every turn of the tires. As I drove further, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows over the desert. The air became cooler, but the tension in my chest only grew tighter. I tried to distract myself by glancing at the scenery, but the plain felt different now. More oppressive. The wind, which had once felt gentle, now howled through the open spaces, carrying with it a strange, disconcerting sound. It was like whispers, faint but sharp, rising and falling with the breeze. I could almost hear words, but they were too muffled to make sense of. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. I needed to find a place to stop, to calm my racing thoughts. A small town, the guide had said, was just ahead. I reached for my phone to check the map, but there was no signal. The screen blinked in and out, just static and silence. The sensation of being alone, truly alone, crept over me again, gnawing at the edges of my mind. When I finally reached the town, it was little more than a few scattered buildings, a diner, a gas station, and a dusty road that stretched back out into the vast nothingness. The place seemed abandoned, even though I knew people must live here. The windows were shut tight, and there was no sign of life, no sound except the wind pushing through the empty streets. I parked the car outside the diner, hoping for a warm meal and maybe some answers. As I entered, the bell above the door jingled softly, and the air inside smelled of stale coffee and grease. An older woman stood behind the counter, wiping it down slowly. Her face was tired, her eyes distant, but when she saw me, a thin smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Traveling through?" she asked, her voice rough, like she hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Just passing by," I replied, forcing a smile. "Have you seen anything strange out there?" I pointed vaguely in the direction of the plain. Her eyes flickered, then she looked away, as though considering whether to answer. For a moment, there was silence, just the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Then, she leaned in a little closer. "You're not the first," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A lot of people come through here. They all ask about the figures. But no one stays long enough to see them, not really." I frowned, sitting down at the counter. "What do you mean?" She sighed, sitting down on the stool across from me, her hands folded in front of her. "Those figures, they're not just people. They don't belong here. They're not alive, not in the way you think. And they don't just stand there. They watch. They wait." My stomach tightened. "What happens if you get too close?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at me with those tired, empty eyes, as if weighing my question. Then, she spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "Some folks think they're ghosts, others say there's something worse. But what I know is this: if you follow those footprints, they lead somewhere you don't want to go. There's a place out there, beyond the desert, where people disappear. The land swallows them up, and no one ever sees them again. Just like the figures. They wait, and they draw you in. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I thought about the footprints I had seen earlier, leading into the desert, and the unnerving sensation that had followed me as I tried to make sense of it all. Could it really be true? Were these figures somehow responsible for the disappearances? The woman's voice shook slightly, a faint tremor in her hands as she reached for a coffee mug. Don't follow them. Don't go out there. Not if you value your life. I sat there in silence for a long moment, trying to process what she had said. My mind raced with questions, but something inside me, a deep, primal instinct, told me I had to leave. To get back in my car and drive away, as far as I could, as fast as I could. But the thought of those figures, of the footprints leading deeper into the desert, gnawed at my insides. I paid the woman, my hands trembling as I grabbed my jacket. As I stepped outside, the wind had grown stronger, and the air felt colder than it had before. The sky above was clouded, the sun hidden behind a veil of gray, casting everything in an eerie, muted light. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. I glanced back at the diner. The woman was still inside, staring at me through the window with a look of quiet warning. I knew I should leave. I knew I should ignore the call of the desert, the lure of the unknown. But something was pulling at me, a strange, insistent force urging me to follow the path those figures had left behind. And so, against every instinct, I got back in my car. The road ahead was empty, just endless stretches of dust and silence. And in the distance, just beyond the horizon, I could see them again. The figures. They were waiting. I drove towards them, the figures becoming clearer with every mile, standing motionless against the endless expanse of sand and dust. The road was deserted, the air thick and oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was waiting for something. My grip tightened around the steering wheel, but a part of me, a growing, unsettling part, urged me onward. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the plain in a ghostly twilight. The world seemed to stretch forever in every direction, and the figures grew larger, their shapes more defined as I approached. Their stillness was unnatural, too perfect. They stood like statues, motionless, silent, yet there was something about them that felt wrong. As I got closer, I could feel my pulse quicken, the thud of my heart beat louder in my ears than the sound of the engine. I parked the car a good distance away from them, unable to get any closer, yet unwilling to leave. The wind picked up, howling across the plain with an eerie, almost human quality to it. It was as if the desert itself was alive, whispering secrets in the dark. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the dry earth. The figures, now close enough to make out their details, stood taller than I had imagined, at least 6 feet, maybe more. Their shapes were human, but their features were distorted, like the vague, shifting outlines of people seen through a fog. Their faces were blurred, as if the very idea of a face was too much for them to retain. They wore clothing, tattered and torn by time, but it was impossible to make out the colors. Everything about them felt wrong. I stood there, frozen in place, watching them. And then, slowly, one of them moved. It was subtle at first, just a shift in position, a twitch of an arm. But then it happened again, and I realized the figures were not completely still. They were waiting for something. Watching. And now, they were aware of me. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, then another, but they didn't move. They just stood there, staring into the distance, their gaze never turning toward me, yet somehow all-encompassing. The wind picked up again, stronger now, biting through my jacket, and with it came the sound, that whispering, almost melodic voice on the edge of hearing. It was a sound I couldn't place, but it seemed to seep into my thoughts, into my very bones. The footprints. The ones I had seen earlier. They still led into the desert, deeper into the empty void. A small part of me, the rational part, tried to tell me it was just the wind, just the strange way the world worked out here. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. My feet moved on their own. Slowly, cautiously, I found myself walking towards the figures. There was no conscious decision, no real thought behind it, just a pull, an almost magnetic force drawing me closer. I could hear the crunch of the earth beneath my boots, each step heavy, echoing in the silence that surrounded me. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and it seemed to come from the very earth itself, as though the land were speaking to me. Come closer. I froze. The voice wasn't coming from any of the figures. It wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It was everywhere, all around me. It was the land itself, speaking, calling me to follow. The cold sweat broke out across my forehead, but I couldn't stop. My feet carried me forward, despite the voice screaming inside my head, turn back. Leave now. But it was too late. The figures were no longer in the distance. They were right there, surrounding me, closing in. I turned, desperate to flee, but the world around me had shifted. The horizon had blurred, the sun now gone, replaced by a dull, sickly glow that lit up the plain with an unnatural hue. The car was gone, nowhere to be seen. The road had vanished, and the endless stretch of desert had become a labyrinth of impossible shapes, twisting and turning on itself. The figures had circled me. Their faces were clearer now, distorted and twisted in a grotesque mockery of human features, their eyes hollow and black as night. They moved slowly, like shadows, their footsteps almost silent. You shouldn't have come. The voice was inside my head now, clear and distinct, filling every corner of my mind. Panic surged through me. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the desert itself was closing in, smothering me. I turned to run, but my legs were heavy, my body unwilling to obey. It felt as though the ground itself was pulling me down, sinking me into the earth. The figures were all around me now, their presence a suffocating weight, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. And then, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, I realized something. I wasn't meant to leave. The footprints that had led me here weren't just the path of the figures, they were my own. I had followed them, step by step, and now I was trapped, part of the endless cycle, just another lost soul in the desert. The figures reached out, their fingers cold, impossibly long, brushing against my skin. I wanted to scream, but the air was gone, the sound choked in my throat. The world around me twisted, the horizon bending and warping as the desert swallowed me whole. And as the darkness closed in, I understood. The figures weren't just waiting for someone to come, they were waiting for someone to become them. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the silhouette of my own figure, standing still in the distance, watching, waiting. I woke to the sound of wind. At first, I thought it was just the usual howling desert wind, harsh and unrelenting, but this time it felt different. The sound was deeper, more resonant, as though it was vibrating in my bones. I blinked, disoriented, and tried to sit up, but my body felt sluggish, weighed down, as if the very air had thickened around me. I looked around, and for a moment, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. The sky above was black, an infinite void, devoid of stars. The plain stretched out endlessly, but there were no familiar landmarks, no road, no horizon. just an oppressive emptiness, like I had slipped between dimensions, lost in some in-between place where time and space no longer made sense. I stood shakily, trying to push myself upright, but something pulled at me. The ground felt soft, almost spongy beneath my feet, and when I looked down, I saw it. The footprints, my footprints, were etched into the earth, leading in all directions, spiraling outward from where I had collapsed. They weren't just mine anymore. There were others, faded and ghostly, weaving in and out of my own, as though dozens of people had walked this same path before me, trapped in this endless cycle. I staggered forward, my legs unsteady, my mind reeling. The figures had vanished, but I could still feel their presence, their eyes, unblinking and endless, watching me from the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled to make sense of everything. Was it real? I asked myself. Was any of it real? I reached for my phone, but it was gone. My wallet, my keys, nothing. There was nothing but the plain, stretching on forever. No landmarks, no direction, no way to escape. The air grew colder, and the whispers began again. At first, they were just faint, as if carried by the wind. But then they grew louder, more insistent. Follow the path. Follow the figures. Follow your fate. My breath quickened. The voice was inside my head again, that same unnerving, all-encompassing sound, but it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, a force that seemed to surround me, pushing me forward, urging me to keep walking. I fought it. My mind screamed for me to stop, to turn back, to run in any direction and just get away. But my feet moved of their own accord, dragging me along the path that seemed to curve inward, toward a place I could not see, yet knew I must reach. It was like being trapped in a dream, one where the more you tried to escape, the more the world twisted and pulled you back in. The whispers grew louder, turning into a chant, a rhythm that pulsed through the air, through the earth, through my very skin. You are one of us. You are here. You belong here. I stumbled, my head spinning, my vision blurring. The ground beneath me began to shift, the earth cracking open like a wound, revealing a dark, gaping chasm. The path was no longer solid, no longer just a trail of footprints. It had become a maw, an abyss that stretched down into the depths of the earth. The figures, now clear and distinct, lined the edges of the chasm, their forms shifting and flickering like shadows, their eyes never leaving mine. I could feel them. I could feel them watching, waiting. They were no longer just in the distance. They were all around me. And they were moving, slowly, inexorably closer. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the wind, lost in the vast emptiness of the plain. The figures reached out with cold, skeletal hands, their fingers stretching impossibly long, brushing against my skin. I flinched, but there was nowhere to go. No place to hide. You are one of us now, the voice echoed, louder than ever, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. You will join us. I fell to my knees, the ground shifting beneath me as the figures closed in, their touch freezing, their presence suffocating. My body trembled, but I couldn't escape. The chasm yawned wider, pulling me toward it, toward the darkness that seemed to consume everything it touched. The figures were everywhere now, their forms solidifying, no longer distorted. They were human, but their faces, those hollow, black eyes, were empty. Soulless. They surrounded me, their faces expressionless, yet there was something in their gaze that told me they knew me, that they had always known me. I reached out, my hands trembling, but they didn't react. They just stood there, silent, waiting for me to understand. And then it hit me, the terrible truth. This place, this desert, was not just a physical location. It was a trap. A prison. A place where souls were lost, trapped in an endless loop, caught in the waiting arms of the figures. The ones who stood motionless in the distance, drawing you closer, always closer, until you became one of them. I could feel the change creeping over me like a shadow falling across my mind. The desert was inside me now. The figures were inside me. I was becoming one of them, my form flickering and shifting as the air around me grew colder, darker. I could hear the others, the ones who had come before me, their voices murmuring in the dark, indistinct but familiar, their whispers blending with mine. I looked down at my hands, but they were no longer mine. They were cold, translucent, fading into the darkness. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw was the figure standing at the edge of the chasm, its hollow eyes staring into mine, a cold smile crossing its face. And then, with a final breath of the desert air, I stepped forward, drawn into the abyss. The darkness was absolute. There were no stars, no light, just the suffocating blackness that pressed in from all sides. My mind, now a blur of fragmented thoughts and fading memories, struggled to make sense of what had happened. How had I gotten here? Was this death? Was I gone? I couldn't feel my body, but I knew I was still aware, still somehow existing. The absence of everything, the absence of sound, of light, of time, was more overwhelming than anything I had ever experienced. It was like I was floating in a void, a place that existed outside of reality. There were no sensations to anchor me. No wind, no whispers, no footprints. Just the feeling of being lost, adrift, without purpose. And then, I felt it. A shift. The air around me stirred, the stillness broken by the faintest sound, a whisper. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing moment until it became undeniable. It was a voice, cold and empty, yet somehow familiar. "You've joined us." I froze. The voice was inside my mind, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't even the voice of the figures, not directly. It was something older, something deeper, like the land itself had spoken, its ancient voice rising from the depths of the desert. And with that voice came the sensation of presence. Not just one presence, but many. Countless others, all around me. I could feel them, their eyes on me, waiting, watching. The figures, the ones I had seen in the desert, they were here. Not in front of me, but around me. Their shapes were indistinct, shifting in the darkness, their hollow eyes reflecting the same emptiness that now filled my soul. I tried to move, to break free, but there was no escape. I was suspended, trapped in a place where there were no walls, no boundaries. Just the weight of endless waiting. Time had no meaning here. The seconds stretched into hours, hours into days, or maybe it was centuries. I couldn't tell. Every moment felt like an eternity, every breath, if I could call it that, felt like it was being stolen from me. And then, there it was again. The whisper. "You were always meant to be here." It was a truth, but not one I understood completely. It wasn't an answer to the questions that had haunted me since I first saw the figures. It wasn't a reason for the endless walk through the desert. It wasn't even an explanation of why I had been drawn to this place in the first place. But it didn't matter anymore. I could feel the others, the ones who had come before me, their presence in this place, trapped in this endless waiting, unable to leave. and the weight of their collected despair pressed in on me as though they were all reaching out, pulling me deeper into the void. "You will wait with us," the voice said, now clearer than ever, its coldness wrapping around my consciousness like a tightening vice. "You will join the others. You will be a part of the endless cycle." And I understood. The desert, the figures, the footprints, they weren't just a trap. They were a destination. A place where lost souls were drawn over and over again to stand in the silence, to become part of the land, part of the waiting. To become just another figure, just another shadow, standing motionless in the distance, waiting for the next fool to come closer, to follow the path they had walked. I had been one of those fools. And now, I was part of them. I could feel myself changing, my body, my mind, my soul fading, becoming less and less. The coldness in me grew, spreading through every fiber of my being, until there was nothing left but the waiting. The whispers continued, mingling with the wind. It was the same chant, the same rhythm, but it no longer scared me. I no longer feared what I had become. It was a fate I had been drawn to, a destiny I could never escape. The figures around me, they had all gone through the same thing. They were the ones who had once walked this path, just like I had. And now, they waited with me, just as I would wait for the next soul to wander into this place. "It's your turn," the voice whispered. And then, I saw them. Not as figures in the distance, but as part of me. I was no longer an observer, but one of them, standing motionless, just another shadow in the desert, waiting. The cycle was complete. The desert was my home now. The endless, empty plain, where time had no meaning and the wind carried the voices of the lost. And as I stood there, silent, my hollow eyes watching the next soul approach, I knew that I, too, would never leave. The next fool would come, and I would be waiting. The Lost Path in Vermont. I had never meant to wander off the beaten path, not in Vermont's dense forests. But there I was, a few miles into the woods, having followed a narrow trail that appeared like any other. The sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting long, creeping shadows across the trail. It was early autumn, the kind of evening where the cool air starts to bite, and the smell of pine and damp earth is so thick you could almost taste it. I had been hiking for hours, and the only company I had was the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves. Vermont's wilderness was supposed to be peaceful, something that made you feel isolated yet somehow whole. But on this trail, something felt wrong. The path I was on now seemed different from the main trail. Narrower, wilder, as though the trees had pulled inward and trapped it in their embrace. I'd been walking for what seemed like ages when I noticed a sign half hidden under a thick pile of fallen leaves. It wasn't anything official, just a worn, wooden post with some faded, illegible lettering. It didn't seem important, yet I felt a strange urge to keep going, as if the path were calling me. I stopped, glanced over my shoulder, and then back down the trail. There was no turning back. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. The sun was setting fast, and I'd been on the trail alone for too long. But as I pressed deeper into the woods, the air around me shifted. The forest seemed to grow heavier, darker. I noticed a rustling to my left, but when I turned, there was nothing there. "It's nothing," I told myself, shaking off the unease that clung to my skin like the chill in the air. But that's when I heard it. A soft sound, like someone walking just a few paces behind me. I froze, straining my ears. The woods were silent again, except for the normal hum of the evening. It must have been an animal, I thought. I could feel my pulse quickening, but I took another step forward, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just the wind, maybe. Yet the rustling came again, this time louder. Not from behind, but from the shadows around me. In the distance, between the trees, I saw what appeared to be a shadow, darker than the rest of the woods. At first, I thought it was just the fading light playing tricks on me, but then it moved. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned sharply, expecting to see a person, but again, nothing. Just the darkened trees, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for me. Okay, calm down, I told myself. It's nothing. Just the woods. You've been walking too long. I wasn't sure if I was reassuring myself or lying to myself. Every step I took felt heavier, and the woods, the very air around me, felt thick with something I couldn't name. I wanted to turn back, but the path was unfamiliar, winding deeper into the forest. The trees, tall and oppressive, seemed to be closing in. Suddenly, I heard a sharp snap of a twig to my left, too close, too deliberate. My breath hitched. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. Just the trees, the branches swaying gently as if the forest itself was breathing. A laugh bubbled up in my chest, a nervous, strained laugh. Get a grip, you're imagining things, I muttered to myself. But I could feel something now, something watching. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The forest was alive in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, that it was just the solitude. But the sounds were there, creeping around me. They grew louder, closer. Whispers almost, as if the forest itself was speaking. Words I couldn't make out, but I knew they were meant for me. Then, I saw it. A shape. Tall and thin, standing just behind a cluster of trees. It wasn't clear at first, just a silhouette, but as I stared, it seemed to move with the shadows, its form almost melting into the night. My body froze, and the hairs on my arms stood up. It wasn't a person, not entirely. It didn't have the clear edges of something real. It was more like a shadow, a stain on the forest. I could feel it staring at me, even though its face was hidden in darkness. I took a step back, then another, my breath quickening. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, and I forced my legs to move, to turn around, to go back. But as I did, I heard the faintest sound of movement behind me. Someone, or something, was following me. I could feel it now. The presence. The eyes on my back. No longer just a shadow, but something real. Something watching. I walked faster, my steps quickening. The whispers grew louder in the wind, faint, incomprehensible. The rustling of leaves intensified, and I could hear the soft crunch of footsteps following my own. I turned again, heart racing, but still, nothing. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly. The shadows blended into the darkening forest, and the sound of footsteps was now right behind me. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers faded. The presence disappeared. The air grew still. I stood there, frozen, my chest heaving with a panic I couldn't shake. The trail ahead was unclear now. It wasn't like it had been before. The familiar path was gone, swallowed by the forest, as though it had never been there. What the hell is happening? My thoughts were frantic now, but there was no explanation. No logical reason for what I was feeling. I turned back. The shadow from earlier was gone, but the sense of being watched never left. A creeping feeling, like the woods themselves were alive, were hiding something that would never let me go. The darkening trees seemed to whisper now, a low murmur in the wind. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the trail was no longer mine to leave. I forced myself to move forward, my legs trembling beneath me, but the forest seemed to press closer, as if it was intentionally guiding me deeper. I glanced back, expecting to see something, or someone, behind me. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling of leaves. Just the eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. I kept walking, trying to steady my breathing. The shadows of the trees were long now, the sun almost gone completely, and the forest had taken on a new, almost unnatural hue. I couldn't explain it, but everything seemed off. The air had thickened, a heaviness in it that made each breath feel like I was breathing underwater. And then, I heard it again. The faintest whisper, so low I almost couldn't hear it. But it was there, unmistakable. It was coming from the direction ahead, deeper into the trees. A rustle, a flicker in the corner of my vision. I turned, my heart racing again, but there was nothing. Nothing but trees and darkening foliage. Just keep moving, I thought. I kept my pace steady, trying not to let panic overtake me. But the sounds continued, faint whispers that seemed to echo from everywhere at once, from the trees, from the very ground beneath my feet. A crack. A loud snap, like a twig breaking underfoot, but not mine. It was too sharp, too purposeful. I froze, listening. My eyes darted around, scanning the trees, the underbrush. But still, nothing. My throat tightened. The feeling of being followed was growing stronger now. More than just a presence. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching, breathing, waiting. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like twisted hands, their shadows twisting in odd, unnatural ways. This is crazy, I told myself, pushing forward. There's nothing here. It's just the woods. Just the dark. But the whispers grew louder. This time, I could make out the words. But they weren't in any language I knew. They were slow, drawn-out syllables that seemed to crawl under my skin, wrapping around my nerves. Follow, stay, watching. The words made my skin crawl, but they didn't stop. They were everywhere. All around me, the trees, the wind, the very earth seemed to whisper. I kept walking, faster now, each step more urgent, my breath shallow. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The trees felt closer. The shadows darker. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were footsteps. Behind me, beside me, above me. I whirled around once again, panic rising in my chest, but there was nothing but the forest and the darkening sky. But this time, something was different. The path, the trail I had been following, was no longer clear. It had changed. Where the ground had once been firm, it was now soft and uneven, the earth beneath my feet turning to wet mud. And the trees, they weren't the same as before. They were twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching out like claws, their bark dark and unnatural. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I was no longer on a trail. I was in the middle of the woods, surrounded by darkness. The trees formed a thick, nearly impenetrable wall around me, their branches creaking as if they were moving on their own. This isn't right, I thought, the first true pang of fear striking me. I've been here before, but I couldn't have. I had never been this deep in the woods. And yet, the feeling of familiarity was undeniable, as if I had walked this exact same path 1,000 times before. My pulse raced. I turned around, but the way I had come was gone. The path I had followed had disappeared, swallowed by the dense forest. I was lost. Trapped in a place that didn't make sense, a place that felt like it was designed to keep me here. A sudden noise broke through the silence. A branch snapping, no, a footstep. A solid, unmistakable footstep. Close. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, between the trees, I saw movement. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, standing perfectly still. It was tall, thin, and dark, its outline barely visible against the backdrop of the night. But I could feel it. It was watching me. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, waiting. This isn't real, I thought desperately. It's just my mind playing tricks. It's just the isolation, the shadows. But the figure took a slow step forward, its footfall muffled by the underbrush, and I could feel my blood run cold. I had to run. I had to get out. I turned and sprinted, my mind racing. The sounds of footsteps, the whispers, followed me, not from behind, but all around me, echoing off the trees. The air was thick, suffocating. The forest seemed to close in with every step I took, and no matter how fast I ran, the trees only seemed to grow taller, the shadows darker. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. I slowed, gasping for air, looking frantically over my shoulder. The forest was silent again, but the quiet was deafening, like a predator waiting patiently in the dark. I stumbled, falling to my knees. My chest heaved with fear, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. The presence was still there, closer than ever. I scrambled to my feet and tried to push forward. I had to find a way out. But every step felt heavier. The forest was closing in on me, the shadows creeping further. I stopped. I had to stop. Something was in front of me. A figure. But this time, I didn't need to see it to know it was there. The weight of its presence pressed down on me, suffocating, like a hand around my throat. And then the whispers returned, louder now, closer. The words clearer. You can't leave. I felt the chill crawl up my spine. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was never meant to leave. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my chest. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent. My body screamed to run, but I couldn't move. The figure in front of me was still there, though it remained hidden within the shadows, like a dark stain against the blackness of the night. My heart was pounding in my ears, the adrenaline thrumming through my veins. It's not real. It's not real, I told myself over and over, as if repeating those words would somehow make it true. But every instinct in my body screamed that this wasn't just fear. This was something far worse. I couldn't see the figure's face, but I could feel it, its eyes, boring into me. It was as if it were trying to read my soul. My body trembled with an unfamiliar coldness, a chill that settled deep in my bones. And then, like a slow drip of ice, a voice came. It was not the whispers anymore, but a single, low murmur, a voice that made the air around me seem to freeze. Why are you running? The voice was soft, almost a caress, but it carried an unnatural weight to it. A heaviness that settled on my shoulders like a shroud. I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, my body frozen in place. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it shift, its presence growing closer, suffocating. "You can't escape," the voice continued, its tone both gentle and menacing. "The forest knows you. It's been waiting for you. You belong here now." My thoughts spun, disjointed. The forest? What did it mean? I didn't belong here. I didn't want to belong here. This is insane. It's just the isolation, I thought, trying to reason with myself, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that was clawing at my insides. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the voice was right. I had been here before. The strange familiarity. The way the forest felt like something I had known for a long time, even though I had never been this deep before. It was all too precise, too deliberate. I swallowed hard, the fear threatening to choke me. I had to leave. I finally took a step backward, my feet unsteady on the uneven ground. But then, the voice came again, louder this time, and the pressure around me intensified. "Don't run. You can't outrun what's already inside you." The words hit like a blow. They made no sense, yet they resonated with something deep within me. A feeling I couldn't explain. My chest tightened as the realization crept in, the forest wasn't just trapping me. It was trying to pull me in, consume me. It was a part of me now. The whispers returned, filling my ears again. They were louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every corner of the woods, from the very trees themselves. "You can't leave. You can't escape." I turned, desperate now. The way I had come was lost in a maze of twisted trunks and thickets that looked nothing like the path I had walked earlier. The forest had shifted, like it was alive, breathing with me. Every tree, every shadow felt as if it were watching, waiting. The ground beneath me was softer now, and I noticed something strange. The dirt was darker, richer, almost like it had been disturbed, as though the earth itself was hungry for me. My mind raced, trying to latch onto something, anything that made sense. I had to get out. There had to be a way. But the deeper I moved, the more disoriented I became. The trees, the sounds, the shifting path, it was all part of the trap. I could feel it closing in on me, the forest tightening its grip. "Where are you going?" The voice was closer now, right behind me, though I couldn't see it. The air was thick, suffocating, and I felt the cold touch of something brushing against my skin. I spun around, gasping, but the figure was gone. The space around me was empty, except for the trees. But it didn't matter. I could feel it. Something was here, watching. In the distance, I thought I saw a flicker of movement. A shadow darting between the trees, too fast to be real, too deliberate to be my imagination. Was I hallucinating? The thought hit me like a jolt of electricity, but I couldn't trust my mind anymore. I had no idea what was real or not. Was the forest toying with me, or had I crossed over into something else, a place where logic didn't apply? The whispering grew louder again, overwhelming, pressing in on all sides. "Stay." I froze. The word was clear. Cold. And it was followed by a faint rustle, like the softest footstep brushing across the forest floor. The shadow shifted again, and this time I knew for sure that I wasn't alone. I took off running, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring the way the ground seemed to swallow my feet with every step. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches brushing against my skin like fingers. The path was gone. I was lost in the dark, and every direction seemed to lead to the same place, deeper into the forest, further into its grasp. I had to get out. I had to. But the shadows stretched longer and darker with each passing moment. And no matter how fast I ran, the forest seemed to pull me back, as though it knew exactly where I was going and that there was no way out. I ran blindly, my feet pounding against the earth, each step sinking deeper into the soft, shifting soil. My heart was racing, a wild, erratic drumbeat in my chest, and my mind screamed for escape. But there was no escape. No way out. The trees around me seemed to close in tighter with every breath I took, their dark forms growing more twisted, their branches like claws reaching for me. Keep moving, I thought, but the thought itself was a lie. I was already lost. The familiar path was gone, swallowed by the forest, and now I was running through an endless maze of trees that seemed to shift and change around me. I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, but I could feel them. The forest itself was whispering, its voice low and soft, curling around me like smoke. The air was thick with it. The atmosphere was heavy, like something pressing down on my chest. Every breath felt labored, as though I were suffocating under the weight of it all. Don't stop, I thought again, urging myself forward. But there was nothing left to run to. Then I saw it, a clearing, a break in the trees. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting long, thin beams of pale light onto the ground. For a moment, I thought I had found an escape, a place where the forest couldn't reach me. I stumbled forward, nearly tripping on the uneven ground, but then I froze. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally still, like a statue carved from the night itself. I could feel its presence, pressing against me, suffocating the air around me. Its face was obscured, just a blank, featureless void of darkness where a face should have been. But I could feel its eyes. They were on me, burning into me, pulling me in. I should have run. I knew I should have. But my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, as if I were rooted to the spot, incapable of escaping whatever this was. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, filling the space around me, drowning out everything else. They were no longer words, just a constant, low hum, like the wind or the rustling of leaves. But beneath it, I heard something else, a voice, calling my name. Come closer. I shook my head, trying to pull away, but my feet wouldn't listen. They took one slow step forward, then another. The figure didn't move, but it was there, drawing me in, urging me closer, as if it were a part of the forest itself, an extension of the darkness. The closer I got, the heavier the air became. It felt like the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on me, suffocating me, trying to drag me into the earth. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the dirt softening into something wet, something alive. And that voice, that horrible, inviting voice, grew louder. Come closer. You belong here. I couldn't think anymore. My thoughts were foggy, drowned in the weight of the whispers. My mind was clouded, my body moving without my will. Every step I took felt like I was falling deeper into something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't escape. And then, in the blink of an eye, I was standing right in front of it. The figure. The dark, featureless face. It loomed over me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, too loud, too fast. It's too late, I thought. I'm too far gone. But just as I was about to reach out, to touch the cold, empty void of its face, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I fell, not into the earth, but into the darkness. It was as though the forest had opened up beneath me, swallowing me whole. My scream was cut off as I plummeted, falling into the blackness, the weight of the forest pulling me down, pulling me under. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my body, sending pain shooting through me. I gasped for breath, disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. But I couldn't. The darkness pressed in from all sides, heavy and thick, and I realized with a horrible certainty that I was no longer in the forest. I was somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't make sense. The air was thick, suffocating, and the ground beneath me was soft and damp. I couldn't see anything. I could only hear the faint rustling of something moving around me, something watching me. The whispers returned, filling the air, surrounding me, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that they weren't coming from the trees anymore. They were coming from the ground, from the earth itself. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest as I spun around, searching for anything, any sign of escape. But the space around me was endless, stretching out into the darkness. The air felt alive with something unseen, something far older than the forest. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, this time right next to my ear. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark, the oppressive silence that pressed in on me. The forest, the path, the figure, they were all gone. I was alone. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was with me. And I realized with growing horror that I would never leave. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, as though the very darkness around me had paralyzed me, holding me in place. The whispers were all around me now, not just from the ground, but from the trees, from the air, from the very soil beneath my feet. Every direction I turned, there was nothing but the crushing weight of silence, broken only by those voices, murmuring, sighing, calling my name. "You belong here. You always have." I clenched my fists, my breath ragged as I struggled to make sense of it. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. There had to be a way out. This was just a nightmare. I was hallucinating. My mind was breaking under the strain of isolation, the weight of the forest closing in on me. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs shaky beneath me. The ground seemed to shift again, pulling me deeper into the earth. I couldn't feel the path beneath my feet anymore. All around me, the trees loomed, their branches twisting unnaturally, as though they were reaching for me, pulling me closer. The air had become thick with the stench of decay, like something had died and was slowly rotting away in the dark. I need to find a way out. I told myself again, but the thought felt distant, fading. I could barely focus on anything anymore, not the voices, not the oppressive silence that threatened to crush me. The darkness was closing in tighter, like a living thing, suffocating me. I was surrounded by it, trapped by it. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, each beat a painful reminder that I was still alive, still feeling the weight of the forest pressing in on me. But I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. Then I saw it. A glimmer of light in the distance, faint and far away, but it was there. I had to get to it. Maybe it was an exit, a way out of this nightmare. I started walking toward the light, the darkness still creeping at my heels, whispering, calling. But no matter how fast I moved, the light never seemed to get any closer. The forest stretched on endlessly, the trees growing taller, their branches weaving together to form an impenetrable canopy. "You'll never leave." The voice was so clear, so close that I spun around, panic rising in my throat. But there was no one. Just the trees. Just the shadows. The light ahead of me was still faint, still out of reach. I stumbled, my mind in a haze, my body moving without thought. The light, it had to be real. I kept walking, my feet dragging through the earth, my legs burning with the effort. The whispers began to grow louder again, filling my ears, twisting into incoherent sounds, as if the forest itself was alive, speaking in tongues. Then, with a sickening jolt, I realized something. The forest wasn't just watching me. It had been waiting for me. The realization hit me like a wave, crashing over me, and for a moment, everything inside me went still. The voices, the shadows, the whispers, they weren't random. They were all parts of a larger, more terrible truth. The forest had been calling to me, pulling me deeper into its heart. The path, the one I had wandered down so carelessly, had been laid out for me, drawn by something ancient and beyond my understanding. I looked down at my hands, trembling. My skin was pale, blotched with patches of cold, clammy sweat. I could feel the energy draining from me, like the forest was siphoning it away, piece by piece. I was no longer just a visitor here. I was part of it now. You belong here. The voice whispered again, not from the trees, not from the earth, but from inside my own mind. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The earth around me felt like it was alive, moving, breathing. The darkness pressed in harder, and the light ahead of me finally faded, swallowed whole by the endless black. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was raw, tight with terror. The forest was closing in, its branches curling around me, pulling me deeper. I couldn't see, I couldn't breathe, but I could feel it, the presence that had been following me. It was here, right beside me, its unseen eyes watching, waiting for me to give in. I had crossed a point of no return. There was no escape. And then I understood, with a sickening certainty, that the forest would never let me go. I was already a part of it, a shadow in its endless dark, lost forever in the winding, shifting path that had no end. The whispers had stopped. The silence was deafening, a terrible void. And I knew, with every bone in my body, that I was not alone. I would never be alone again. Demonic Shore in New Jersey. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. Just a weekend to clear my head, to forget about the stress of work and the noise of city life. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the New Jersey coast. The beach was quiet, especially at night. A perfect place to relax and watch the stars, or so I thought. We had set up a small campfire, the flames flickering in the cool night air. The sound of the ocean crashing against the shore was soothing. For a while, everything felt perfect. But then, something strange caught my eye. A faint red light, far out near the water's edge. At first, I thought it might be a distant boat or a fisherman's lantern. But the light didn't move in any direction I could make sense of. It just hovered, as if frozen in place, a dull red glow casting an eerie reflection on the dark waters. "Hey, do you guys see that?" I asked, pointing toward the light. At first, no one responded. My friends were busy chatting around the fire, oblivious to the strange sight. But when they turned to look, the light was gone. "Probably just a ship passing by," Mark said, shrugging it off. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept staring at the spot where the light had been, willing it to reappear. There was something unnatural about it. I didn't know what it was, but it felt wrong. "Let's go down to the water," I said, trying to sound casual. "I want to see if I can find it again." Without waiting for an answer, I stood up and made my way toward the shoreline. The others hesitated, but eventually followed. As I walked closer to the water, the chill in the air grew more intense. The sound of the waves grew quieter, like the beach was absorbing all sound, leaving only the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. And then, I saw it again. The red light, much closer now, moving slowly along the shore, tracing the water's edge like it was searching for something. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my skin prickled with an unexplainable fear. I turned to call out to my friends, but before I could speak, something stopped me. A coldness, unlike anything I had ever felt before, gripped my body. It started in my feet and traveled upwards, as if my very bones were freezing from the inside out. I tried to move, to step back, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed. My heart raced, but I couldn't get my body to obey my frantic thoughts. "Guys!" I managed to shout, but my voice came out strangled, distant, as if the words were being swallowed by the night itself. The others started to approach me, but they were frozen too. They couldn't move any more than I could. And then, the light was right in front of us. It was no longer distant, no longer something to dismiss. It was here, hovering inches above the sand, glowing with an unnatural intensity. The beach was silent. The air was thick with fear. The waves, the wind, everything was muted, as if the world itself had paused in this terrible moment. I could feel it now. A presence. Not just from the light, but from the very shore. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse, alive with an energy that didn't belong here. It was as if the ocean itself had turned against us, calling us into its depths. I could feel the weight of something watching us, something that wanted us closer. But I couldn't move. None of us could. And then it happened. The light flared, and with it, an icy wind cut through the air, slamming into me like a wall. The paralysis deepened. I couldn't even scream anymore. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This isn't real. It's just a trick, a hallucination. It has to be. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The red light blinked once, twice, as if acknowledging our helplessness. And then it began to move again, slowly, like it was leading us somewhere, dragging us forward against our will. I wanted to run, to fight against the force that held me in place, but my body betrayed me. Every attempt to resist felt like my very soul was being drained away. As the light moved, I felt a deep, gnawing fear. This wasn't just an eerie light. This was something much worse. Something that had been waiting for us, waiting for the moment when we would come close enough to see it. And now, I couldn't look away. We couldn't look away. The last thing I remember was the sand beneath me shifting, pulling me forward, as though the beach itself was swallowing me whole. I don't know how long it lasted. Time didn't seem to make sense. My sense of reality was slipping away, like sand running through my fingers. The red light, the cold, the feeling of being watched, they all seemed to blur together into a single, suffocating presence. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light stopped. It hovered just a few feet away, casting long, grotesque shadows on the sand, the water rippling unnaturally around it. I couldn't move. My body felt like it had been frozen in place, but my mind was racing. Why couldn't I move? Why couldn't we just leave? I turned to look at my friends. Mark, Sarah, and Jason were all there, still rooted to the spot, their eyes wide with terror. But something was different about them now. Their faces were pale, almost ghostly, and their mouths hung open as if they were trying to scream but couldn't. Their eyes, however, didn't look at me. They were staring past me, past the light, as if they could see something I couldn't. What do they see? What is this thing? The soundless wind swirled around us, carrying a strange, pungent scent like something decaying. I wanted to gag, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to cry for help, but nothing came out. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. And then I felt it. A tug. Not a physical tug, but a pull deep within me, like an invisible hand was wrapping around my insides, pulling me forward. It was the light. It wanted me. No, I can't. But the force was too strong. My feet slid across the wet sand as if they were no longer connected to my body. The paralysis only deepened, and with every step I took toward the light, the pull intensified, dragging me helplessly forward. It felt like my will, my very soul, was being siphoned away with each passing second. Please, I managed to whisper, but it was weak, barely audible over the overwhelming quiet. The others, they were moving too. Slowly, as though they were sleepwalking, but their eyes were still locked on the light, wide and unblinking, completely unseeing of everything else around them. What was happening to them? What was happening to me? The light flickered, almost as if it was aware of my thoughts, as if it was toying with me. I didn't understand why it hadn't consumed us already. But I didn't have the strength to question it anymore. I could feel my mind stretching, unraveling with every step toward the shore. The red light was no longer just a thing in front of me. It had become a part of me, of us, as if it was rooting itself inside our very souls. As we drew closer, the light grew brighter, and the air grew colder. I could see it now, not just the light, but the shapes in the darkness around it. Twisted, half-formed figures, shadows that moved just out of the corner of my eye. They're not just shadows. They're watching us. Watching me. I tried to look away, but my head wouldn't turn. I couldn't break the trance. I was no longer in control. I was losing myself. Then, a sudden movement broke the stillness. Sarah, her eyes wide and unblinking, stumbled forward as though something inside her had finally given way. She fell to the ground, her body twitching unnaturally. A low, guttural sound slipped from her throat, something between a moan and a scream. I could see the sand around her start to move, almost as if it were alive, crawling toward her. The sand. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't the sand. It was something else. Something beneath it. Something that had been waiting. The shadows around us began to shift, converging towards Sarah's body. Her mouth opened wide, but no sound came out, just a dry rasp as her body spasmed. It was as if the light was feeding on her fear, drawing something from her. And that same pull, that same cold, began to suffocate me again. It felt like I was being pulled into the depths of the ocean, dragged under by an unseen force. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But there was nothing left in me. The darkness shifted once more. I could hear Sarah's breathing, shallow, ragged, and then silence. The shadows had consumed her, her body disappearing into the dark, like she was never there to begin with. And then I felt it, something deeper than fear. a dark presence filling the space around us. The shore was no longer just a beach. It had become a place where the earth itself had opened up, where something old and terrible had risen from the depths of the ocean to claim us. And it was waiting, watching, for the others. For me. But I could no longer feel my legs. My vision was blurring. My breath shallow. It was too late. I couldn't see. My vision was clouded by a heavy fog, but it wasn't the kind of fog that rolled in from the ocean. No, this was different. It was a thick, oppressive darkness, one that twisted around me, curling into my throat, suffocating any thoughts I might have had. The world seemed distant now, an echo I couldn't touch, as though the shore itself had turned into a place outside of time. Sarah. Her name echoed in my mind, but it felt like it was being swallowed up by the darkness that had claimed her. The ground beneath me was cold, shifting, alive. It felt as though it was swallowing me too, inch by inch, with each ragged breath I took. I tried to lift my hands to wipe away the fog from my eyes, but my arms felt heavy, uncooperative, like they belonged to someone else. The weight of the night itself pressed down on me, and I couldn't understand why I couldn't escape. The red light was still there, pulsing in the distance. It was closer now, brighter, casting shadows that crawled across the sand like living things. It beckoned us forward, each pulse a whisper, a promise of something far worse than death. The air was thick with the stench of decay now, stronger than before, and I could hear it, the faintest scratching sound, like claws dragging against the sand, moving slowly behind me. No. My heart began to race, panic flooding my chest. I turned, but my feet wouldn't move, and when I tried to scream, the words caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I could hear breathing now, low and uneven, coming from behind. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was deeper, like a growl that had been torn out of the earth itself. Mark? Jason? I wanted to shout, to call out to them, but my body was not my own anymore. I felt like I was being drawn into the red light, as if it were pulling me towards something that wasn't just waiting in the shadows, but was already inside me. The growl intensified, and I felt it, a tug, a presence that wasn't just a sound, but something far worse, creeping up my spine, settling in my chest. It was suffocating. I could feel my heart racing, every beat a drum that echoed too loud in the silence. And then, slowly, ever so slowly, I began to understand. The figures in the dark weren't just shadows. They were watching us. Watching me. Where are they? I wanted to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. The figures shifted, coming closer, slipping out from the darkness. They weren't human, not anymore. Their limbs were twisted and elongated, their skin pale and slick, almost translucent. Their eyes, there were no eyes. Only hollow sockets that bled a dark, viscous substance dripping onto the sand. I tried to move, but it was like my feet were cemented in place. I could only watch as the figures closed in around me, circling, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. No. A cold hand, a touch so cold it burned, landed on my shoulder. I froze. It wasn't a hand, not really. It was a claw, long and gnarled, yet skin rough and ashen. The grip tightened, pulling me forward. My vision blurred, and my mind raced with fear, trying to make sense of what was happening. I'm going to die here. But I wasn't dead yet. The thought startled me, pulling me back from the edge of panic. I had to do something. I had to break free. The red light pulsed again, its glow shifting like a living thing, and suddenly, I felt it, something deep inside me, a crack in the darkness. A sliver of light, a thought, a moment of clarity. Run. It was all I could think of. I had to move. I had to fight. With a surge of desperation, I yanked my body away from the claws, feeling the cold scrape against my skin as I twisted and stumbled backward. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away from those things, away from the light. But my legs felt like lead, every step slow and heavy, like I was running through molasses. I could hear them following, their unholy growls echoing behind me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The light was still there, pulling me, wrapping around me like chains, threatening to drag me back into the darkness. Why can't I move faster? I felt my heart hammering in my chest, my throat tight with fear. The shore seemed to stretch on endlessly, a desolate, shifting nightmare. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A figure. Tall, looming, a silhouette in the distance. Is that human? I didn't know. I didn't care. I just needed to reach it. I ran, stumbling over the sand, my body screaming in protest, but I kept going, my breath ragged and desperate. The figure was closer now, and I could see it more clearly. It wasn't human. It had the same hollow eyes, the same twisted limbs, but it stood taller, more imposing, like a leader among the others. And it was waiting for me. I stopped, frozen in place. I couldn't move. The red light flickered again, brighter now, and I could feel the cold grip of terror tighten around my chest. It was too late. They had me. I couldn't breathe. Every part of me screamed to run, to get away from the thing that loomed before me, but my body wouldn't respond. My feet were frozen in place, as if the very sand beneath me had become a trap, pulling me deeper into the ground with every passing second. The red light flickered again, almost in rhythm with the frantic pounding of my heart. The figure stood tall, towering above me, its silhouette distorted by the eerie glow. Its body seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the light, each movement sharp and unnerving. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were nothing more than two empty voids, oozing that same black, thick liquid that dripped onto the sand, forming small puddles that hissed and bubbled as if they were alive. I tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't leave my throat. It was as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating me, and each breath became harder than the last. The figure didn't move toward me, it simply stood there, watching, its presence filling the air with an oppressive weight. What is it? The question echoed in my mind, but there was no answer. Just silence. And that growl. The low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the shore, a sound that rattled my skull. It wasn't coming from the figure. No. The growl was coming from all around me, from beneath the sand, from the water lapping against the shore, from the very earth itself. 1,000 unseen creatures, waiting, watching, hungry. I wanted to fall to my knees, to beg for mercy, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as though I had been drained of all strength, all will, reduced to nothing more than a puppet tangled in invisible strings. My mind screamed at me to act, to fight, to do something, but my body remained still, paralyzed under the weight of the thing that was staring at me. Sarah. Her face flashed in my mind, her smile, her laugh, the sound of her voice. It felt so far away now, like a dream that had slipped through my fingers. I could barely remember the last time I had seen her, heard her. Had she seen this too? Had she? No. I couldn't think like that. I had to focus. I had to find a way out of this. The figure shifted. A slow, deliberate movement, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. My skin prickled, and for the first time since I had arrived on this cursed shore, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. This wasn't just a creature from the shadows, it was something ancient, something evil, something that had been waiting for me, waiting for all of us. I could feel it in the very air, in the oppressive silence that had settled over the beach. It wasn't just this one entity that was out of place. No, this place itself was a nightmare, a tear between worlds that had bled through to ours. I tried to swallow, to regain control over my own body, but all I could taste was the bitter, metallic tang of fear in my mouth. The red light flickered again, and the growl deepened, becoming almost a roar. The sand shifted beneath my feet, the ground itself trembling as though it were alive, as if something beneath the surface was stirring, awakening. I had to move. But how? My legs were still frozen, every muscle unwilling to respond. The air seemed to get thicker, colder, and I felt the presence of something else, something watching me from behind. I turned my head slowly, hoping, praying that there was some other person, some sign of help. But all I saw were more figures, more shadows, tall and thin, their faces obscured by darkness, moving in my peripheral vision. They were here. They had always been here. And then, as though sensing my thoughts, the thing in front of me stepped forward, its long, twisted limbs creaking like the ancient wood of a forgotten shipwreck. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, and I felt a pressure in my chest as if it were pushing against my heart. I could feel my thoughts slipping, my consciousness hazy, as if I were being drawn into a vortex, a swirling, suffocating pull that threatened to consume me. Run. The word whispered through my mind again. It was a spark. A glimmer of something, anything. I didn't know where the strength came from, but suddenly, I moved. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just ran. I stumbled across the sand, my legs shaking with every step, my body finally reacting to the terror that had paralyzed it moments before. But the beach stretched endlessly, the shore curving into a never-ending horizon. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to move. I couldn't stay here. Not with them. But the further I ran, the worse it got. The red light was now behind me, growing dimmer with every step I took. The growl faded, replaced by the sound of something dragging through the sand, something close. I dared not look back. I knew I couldn't outrun whatever was chasing me. I had to find shelter. I had to hide. I could barely see anything through the thickening fog, but I thought I saw something up ahead, dark shapes, towering shapes. A building? A shack? I pushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I reached the structure, if you could call it that, and slammed my body against the door. It creaked open with a sound that made my stomach twist. I fell inside, slamming it shut behind me, gasping for air. I was inside. Safe, for now. But the darkness didn't leave. It followed me in. The growl echoed through the walls. And the worst part? I could still hear them, they were out there. The door groaned under the weight of something pushing against it, something that didn't belong. My heart hammered in my chest as I pressed my back against the wooden planks, trying to silence my panicked breathing. The room was small, just a shack, no electricity, no windows, just the stifling scent of salt water and decay. The walls felt as if they were closing in around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. The growl had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, suffocating, oppressive. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any movement. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own pulse, racing like it was trying to break free from my chest. What's happening? I didn't understand. The red light had faded, but the terror hadn't. It had followed me here, into the very heart of this forsaken place. Whatever it was, whatever those things were, they weren't finished with me. They were still out there, still waiting. The faintest sound broke the stillness, a creak from somewhere in the shack. My eyes shot toward the source, but I saw nothing. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, stretching into grotesque shapes that shifted when I wasn't looking. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I couldn't. The cold had seeped into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. I was trapped in my own fear. Stay calm. Think. I tried to force myself to focus, to remember everything I had seen, everything I had experienced. The red light. The shadows. The figures on the shore, watching, waiting. It wasn't just a coincidence. I knew that now. This wasn't some simple haunting. It was something older, something deeper. Something tied to this cursed place, a thing that was bound to the land, to the very ocean that stretched endlessly in front of me. I thought of Sarah, of what I had left behind. I had to find her. I had to warn her. But how could I leave this shack? How could I escape this nightmare? The door shuddered again, louder this time. Something was outside. I could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing against the wood. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it move, but I knew it was there. And I knew it wasn't alone. The temperature in the shack dropped, and with it, a wave of dread that made my skin crawl. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the faint light from the cracks in the walls. The darkness was now complete, all-consuming. My breath came out in ragged gasps, visible in the air like smoke. I tried to hold my ground, but the force pushing against the door was growing stronger, relentless. Suddenly, I heard it. A voice. Soft, like a whisper, but it wasn't my own thoughts. It was something else, something pulling at my consciousness, like invisible hands trying to wrap themselves around my mind. Come closer. It was a command. A lure. The same voice I had heard on the beach, the same voice that had tempted me closer to the water. It was beckoning me, pulling me toward the very thing I had been trying to escape. I couldn't fight it. I didn't want to fight it. The temptation was too strong, too seductive. No. I slammed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. It was inside my head now, like a parasite, feeding on my fears. You're mine. I tried to push away from the door, to find a way out, but my legs wouldn't move. They were rooted to the ground, held by some unseen force. My body was no longer my own. It was as if the darkness itself had claimed me, wrapped its tendrils around my mind, twisting my will. I need to get out. I have to escape. But even as I thought it, I felt myself moving toward the door. My feet dragged across the floor, each step taken against my will. The shack no longer felt like a refuge, it felt like a trap. I was walking toward my doom. I reached the door. My hand reached out, trembling, and I gripped the handle. It turned easily, as if it were inviting me to step into the darkness beyond. The air outside was thick, heavy with the scent of the ocean and something else, something rotten, decayed. The red light flickered again, visible through the cracks in the door, beckoning me. "Don't go." The voice was louder now, not just in my head, but in the air, vibrating the walls. I hesitated. I knew what was waiting for me outside. I knew it wasn't just the beach or the light. It was them. The creatures. The things that had been stalking me from the beginning. But then, a sound, a cry, no, a scream. It was Sarah. I recognized it. She was out there. Somewhere. I couldn't just leave her. With one final surge of strength, I threw the door open. The beach was empty. There was no red light. No figures in the distance. No growl. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt watched. The sand beneath my feet felt wrong, as if it were shifting, moving like it was alive. I looked around, my heart racing, but saw nothing. Only the vast emptiness of the shoreline. The fog was rolling in, thicker than before, and I could barely make out the outline of the ocean in the distance. I took a step forward, then another, my legs shaky. But then, I stopped. The footprints. They were mine, faint, barely visible against the darkened sand, but they weren't leading forward. They were leading backwards, toward the shack. I turned. My breath caught in my throat. The shack was gone. In its place was a vast, empty stretch of beach, as if it had never existed. As if it had been swallowed whole by the sea. And I was still here. The haunted house in Missouri. It was late when we arrived, later than we had planned. The drive had taken longer than expected, winding down country roads, and when we finally saw the house looming in the distance, it seemed almost unreal. The old farmhouse sat atop a hill, isolated from the rest of the world by thick woods. The windows were dark, and the only sound was the low rustle of leaves in the night breeze. I remember looking at it and feeling uneasy. It wasn't that the house was run down or particularly intimidating, but there was something about it. Something in the way the moonlight seemed to cast unnatural shadows against its wooden walls, something in the stillness that felt too heavy. My wife, Laura, didn't share my misgivings. She was excited, too excited, maybe. We had been searching for a new start, a place to escape the bustle of city life. This old house had seemed perfect when we first found it online, and the price was too good to pass up. A little charm, a little history, it all seemed perfect. But as we stepped out of the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us. "It'll be fine," Laura said, brushing her hand against my arm as if to reassure me. "It's just an old house." We knew it would be a bit eerie. I nodded, trying to push my discomfort aside. We grabbed our bags from the trunk and walked up the creaky steps to the front door. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of old wood mixed with the scent of wet earth. The house seemed to breathe with us, like it was alive in some way. But I didn't mention any of this to Laura. I didn't want to seem ridiculous. The door was unlocked. It opened with a slow, complaining groan, and we stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It wasn't the usual chill of an old house. It felt like the cold was coming from within the walls themselves, seeping into the air, into my bones. I looked around, trying to shake off the feeling, but the darkness pressed in from all sides. There was no furniture, just bare floors, peeling wallpaper, and a staircase that led up into shadow. "Wow," Laura said, looking around. "It's definitely got character." I didn't respond. My eyes kept darting toward the far corner of the room. There, in the dim light, I thought I saw something, a figure, standing motionless. My heart skipped a beat. But when I blinked, it was gone. I exhaled, trying to calm myself. It's just the lighting, I told myself. Just shadows. Laura was already moving through the house, exploring. I'll check out the kitchen, she said, her voice echoing in the empty space. I stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, unsure whether to follow or stay. Then I heard it. A sound, a soft, almost imperceptible creak, like someone had shifted their weight on the stairs. I turned sharply, my pulse racing. But there was nothing. I glanced up the staircase. The shadows seemed to shift, as if something was moving there, just out of sight. Are you coming? Laura called, snapping me out of my thoughts. I forced myself to move, following her into the kitchen. But the unease didn't leave. If anything, it grew worse with each passing moment. As we unpacked and started to settle in, I kept hearing things, footsteps in the hall, whispers just out of earshot. I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind, or my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I heard it again. The soft creak of floorboards above us, followed by the faintest sound of something dragging across the floor. My heart hammered in my chest, and I held my breath, listening. I could hear Laura's even breathing beside me, oblivious. I wanted to wake her, to tell her about the noise, but I didn't. I didn't want to seem paranoid, especially not on our first night. It's just the house, I thought again, but the voice inside me didn't believe it. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel it pressing in on me, filling the room with a sense of dread. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing in time with my own heart. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. Get out. The voice was barely audible, but it was there. It was coming from above us, from the floorboards. My skin prickled, and my blood turned to ice. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was lie there, wide-eyed in the dark, and listen as the whispering grew louder. Get out. I turned to Laura, but she was still asleep, unaware of the voice that had just filled the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was nothing, just a figment of my imagination. But I knew. Deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning came too quickly, dragging me from the restless sleep I'd tried to force. The light filtering through the windows felt harsh, almost accusatory, like the house itself was glaring at me. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the lingering fear from the night before. But the moment I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the chill returned, just as sharp, just as cold. I glanced over at Laura, still sound asleep, her face peaceful and unaware of the dread that had gripped me. I got up quietly, careful not to disturb her, and made my way downstairs. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Every step I took seemed to echo through the empty rooms, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I tried to push the unsettling thoughts from my mind, but it was hard. The house felt wrong. The floors creaked in places they shouldn't. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. There was something watching me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in every fiber of my being. I made my way into the kitchen, hoping a cup of coffee would clear my head. As I started to brew the coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, just out of sight. I turned quickly, expecting to see Laura, but the kitchen was empty. My breath caught in my throat. The hairs on my neck stood up as I stared at the empty doorway leading into the hallway. It wasn't just the silence. It was the presence, the feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I clearly was. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's just the house," I whispered to myself. "It's old. It's creaky. It's just a house." But as I turned back to the counter, I heard it again. The soft creak of floorboards above. Step, creak, step, creak. Slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth above me. I froze, staring at the ceiling, my pulse pounding in my ears. It couldn't be the house settling. The sounds were too rhythmic, too intentional. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were comforting. I had to go up there. I had to see what was causing the noise. I stepped toward the stairs, each creak underfoot amplifying the tension in my chest. My hand trembled on the banister as I ascended, the darkness above swallowing the light from downstairs. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest as though I was walking into something thick, something oppressive. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dim, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to pulse with the shadows. I stepped forward, my feet moving with hesitation. The house felt like it was holding its breath, as if it knew I was coming. At the end of the hallway was a door. It looked normal enough, but it wasn't the door that had been creaking. The sounds had been coming from the space behind it, from the attic. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I had to open that door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. The moment I touched it, a cold shock ran through me, as if the door itself had been waiting for me. The knob turned with a low, groaning squeal, and the door creaked open. The attic was dark. I could barely make out the edges of the room, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and hunched, seemed to shift as though it was standing just behind the stacks of old boxes. But when I turned fully to look, it was gone. I stepped into the attic, every sense heightened. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and mildew filled my nose. The silence up here was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of what seemed to be fabric. I walked toward the far corner of the room, my steps careful and slow. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a coat or a piece of old cloth hanging from a nail on the wall. But as I drew closer, I realized it was something much worse. The fabric was moving, gently swaying as though stirred by an unseen hand. My blood turned to ice. The swaying wasn't caused by wind or any natural force. It was as if something, or someone, was gently tugging at the fabric, making it sway, almost in rhythm with my own breathing. I reached out a shaking hand, my fingers brushing against the fabric. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the moment I touched it, a sharp, guttural whisper sliced through the air. "Get out!" I jerked my hand back, heart pounding in my chest. The whisper wasn't from behind me. It was coming from all around me. The walls, the shadows, the attic itself, it was as though the house was alive, feeding on my fear. The room seemed to close in on me, and the air grew so thick I could barely breathe. The attic, once just a place filled with old things, now felt like a trap. I turned to leave, but before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me, sending me into darkness. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, my hands numb from fear, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the house itself was inside my mind. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. I could hear something, footsteps, dragging, slow and deliberate, coming toward me. "Get out," the voice repeated, growing closer. "Get out, now!" In a blind panic, I backed away from the door. I stumbled, falling to the floor, my hands searching desperately for anything to hold on to. And then I saw it. At the far side of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A pale, ghostly figure with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. It was watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare at it as it slowly, relentlessly, began to move toward me. The figure moved closer with an eerie slowness, as if savoring my fear. Its shape was distorted, like a blurry reflection in a dirty mirror. It seemed to shift with every blink of my eyes, and I couldn't tell if it was a person, a ghost, or something far worse. Its hollow eyes bored into mine, pulling me deeper into a terror I could not escape. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, tight as if something invisible was choking the life from me. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the attic pressing against me, closing in with every breath I took. "Get out!" The voice came again, a low, guttural whisper, but this time it was accompanied by a movement in the shadows. The figure tilted its head, as though it were listening to the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel my pulse in my ears, louder than the whispers, louder than the scratching noises behind the walls, louder than the creaking of the house. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from whatever this thing was, but my body refused to obey. My legs were frozen, my feet stuck to the floor like I was rooted in place by some invisible force. The figure stopped moving. It hovered just at the edge of my vision, an ominous silhouette in the dark. I dared not blink. I couldn't look away. The air grew colder, biting, and I felt the temperature drop so rapidly that I could see my breath in front of me, like a fog swirling in the unnatural chill. But it wasn't just cold, it was a feeling of cold, a cold that wrapped around my bones and crawled under my skin, leaving me with nothing but a creeping dread. "Why are you here?" the voice rasped. It wasn't coming from the figure anymore, it was inside my head, like the thoughts of someone who had been there for far longer than I could ever understand. "Why did you come to this house?" I wanted to answer, but the words caught in my throat. I had no explanation for why we had moved here. A part of me wondered if the house had called to us, had chosen us for some reason I couldn't fathom. But I couldn't speak, couldn't form a coherent thought in the face of whatever this presence was. It stepped closer, its figure becoming clearer with every passing moment. Its skin was pale, sickly, like wax that had been melted and refrozen too many times. Its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, gazed at me, but there was no warmth, no humanity. Just emptiness. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing on me, making my chest tighten even further. It felt as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. I struggled to breathe, but my body refused to cooperate. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was clearer now, almost a growl, as the figure reached out a hand toward me. The fingers were elongated, twisted, unnaturally long, like a creature that had been waiting in the darkness for far too long. The nails scraped the air, a faint, screeching sound that made my stomach churn. "You'll never leave." I stumbled backward, my hands pressing against the floor for balance. I needed to get away, needed to escape. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, my mind racing to find any way out of this nightmare. The attic door was still locked, but I couldn't just stand there. And then, as though by some twisted mercy, the door creaked open. I rushed for it without a second thought, ignoring the dread clawing at me, pulling me back. I shoved the door open with my shoulder, gasping for air as I stumbled into the hallway. The light from the stairs felt blinding after the suffocating darkness of the attic. I didn't stop running. My feet flew down the stairs, almost tripping over themselves, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. As I reached the bottom, I skidded into the living room, looking around for Laura, desperate for someone, anyone, to reassure me that this wasn't real. But the room was empty. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized the house was quiet again. Too quiet. There was no sign of the figure, no sound of its movements, no whispering voice in my head. For a fleeting moment, I thought I had imagined it all. That it was just the stress, the unfamiliarity of the house playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It was still there, pressing on me from all sides. I looked around the room, my eyes searching the corners. My gaze fell on the old grandfather clock by the window. Its pendulum swayed slowly, rhythmically, as if it were in tune with the beating of my own heart. And then, just as I thought I was beginning to settle, I saw it again. A figure standing in the doorway of the kitchen. A pale, translucent form that flickered in and out of view. It wasn't the same one I'd seen in the attic, but it didn't matter. It was another ghost, another presence here to remind me that this house was alive with something dark, something malevolent. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stood motionless, its face obscured by the shadows, but I could feel it staring at me. Waiting. Watching. And as the light flickered once more, I heard it. The voice from the attic, echoing in my head once again. You will never leave. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was unraveling, thread by thread, as the shadows in this house seemed to close in from all sides. The voices, the figures, the oppressive silence that followed each manifestation, it was all too much. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I staggered back, away from the flickering figure in the doorway. My heart pounded louder than ever, but this time, I wasn't sure if it was the fear or if the house itself was breathing, its walls expanding and contracting like a living thing. I needed to find Laura. I needed to tell her it wasn't safe here, that we were being consumed by something we couldn't understand. But where was she? The house had turned into a maze. Each door I opened led to another room that was unfamiliar, and yet somehow familiar. The same cold, the same whispers, the same flickering lights. It was like I was trapped in a loop, running through the same house over and over, unable to escape its grasp. Laura! My voice cracked as I called out, but it was swallowed by the heavy silence. I knew she was here, somewhere, but it felt like the house was playing with me, leading me further away from her. The temperature dropped again. I could feel my breath coming out in invisible puffs, the air thick with a biting chill that wasn't natural. It was the same sensation I had felt in the attic, the one that made my blood run cold. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone, or something, was following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the shadows deep and still. Get out, the voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. It felt like it was vibrating through my bones. You don't belong here. I turned and ran, ignoring the feeling of dread that weighed me down. My mind screamed for me to stop, to listen to the voice, to leave this cursed place before it was too late. But I couldn't stop. I had to find Laura. I had to make sure she was okay. I pushed through the front door, desperate for the outside world. But as soon as I stepped onto the porch, I froze. Laura was standing there, her back to me, staring out into the night. The way she stood, so still, so unnaturally rigid, it wasn't her. Laura? My voice trembled, my breath shallow. She didn't move. Her head didn't even turn. I took a step toward her, my heart hammering in my chest. Laura, please. And then, in one swift motion, she turned around. Her face wasn't hers. Her eyes were hollow, the pupils swallowed by a dark, swirling void. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, her teeth sharp and jagged, glistening in the dim light. I stumbled back, my heart thudding in my chest. What have you? What is this? You shouldn't have stayed, she whispered, her voice a rasping, distorted echo. You should have left when you had the chance. The smile on her face widened. It wasn't her smile. It wasn't her eyes. This wasn't my wife. It was something else. Something that had taken her, used her as a vessel to torment me. To lure me in. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the porch. The house behind me creaked ominously, the door slamming shut on its own, as if the house itself was closing in on me, trapping me forever. Please, I pleaded, my voice a desperate whisper. Don't let this be real. The figure that was Laura tilted its head, as if it were amused by my fear. It's too late for you, it said, the voice an unnatural mix of her tone and something dark, something ancient. And then, as I watched in horror, the figure began to dissipate, melting into the night air like smoke. The chilling smile lingered a moment longer before vanishing completely. For a second, the world was still. I tried to stand, my legs shaking, my heart in my throat, but then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of someone, or something, breathing behind me. I turned slowly. There, standing at the doorway, was the original figure from the attic. The one with the distorted face, the hollow eyes, and the long, twisted hands. It stepped forward, each step echoing with the weight of doom. You can't leave, it whispered. I ran. I ran through the house, out the back door, into the yard, away from everything that had once been familiar. My breath was ragged, the night air cold and biting against my skin. I didn't dare look back. I ran until my legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, my mind swirling with disbelief. The house loomed in the distance, an ominous shadow against the dark sky. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure, standing at the window. It wasn't Laura. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was the figure from the attic. The one that had haunted me all this time. I knew, in that moment, that the house would never let us leave. We would never be free. I didn't know how much time had passed. My mind was a tangled mess of panic and disbelief, still reeling from the horrors I'd witnessed. The sound of my own heartbeat echoed in my ears, drowning out all else as I lay in the yard, unable to move. The air around me seemed thick, oppressive, like the house itself was reaching out, pulling me back into its cursed grasp. I couldn't feel my legs. I couldn't feel anything. My body was numb, but my mind was alive with terror. The image of Laura, if it had even been her, kept replaying in my head. The grotesque smile, the hollow eyes. It wasn't her. It wasn't anything human. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Where was she? What had happened to her? The house behind me loomed, a dark, malevolent presence against the starless sky. The windows, those cursed, eye-like windows, were glowing faintly, as if beckoning me to return. But I knew better. I had to leave. I had to get as far away from this place as possible. I forced myself to move, dragging my body through the damp grass, my muscles screaming in protest. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the darkness. But the yard was empty, silent. Then, the sound. A whisper, faint but clear. It was my name. James. I froze. It came again, closer this time, as if someone was standing just behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty yard. And yet, the whispering persisted. James. It was coming from the house. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to go back. But something in me, the same part of me that had been drawn to this cursed place in the first place, urged me forward. The voice, now faint but undeniably familiar, called again. James, please, come back. I stood, trembling, my eyes fixed on the house. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But that voice, it was Laura's. Her voice. I knew it. I had to know what had happened to her. I staggered to my feet, the ground beneath me seeming to sway with each step. As I approached the house, the door swung open by itself, revealing the dark hallway within. The same hallway where I had seen those terrifying figures, the ones that haunted me every time I closed my eyes. But I couldn't stop now. I stepped inside. The air in the house felt colder than before. I could see my breath in the dim light, the chill seeping into my bones. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each step echoing loudly in the silence. I called out, my voice trembling. Laura? Is that you? The house answered with nothing but an eerie stillness. But then, the lights flickered, and I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hall. At first, I thought it was Laura. Her face, pale, hauntingly familiar, stared at me from the shadows. But then, I saw the eyes. They were empty. Hollow. Dark. It wasn't her. It was the thing that had taken her. No, I whispered, backing away. No. The figure began to move toward me, slowly, almost gliding across the floor. The smile stretched across its face, an unnatural, grotesque thing. You should have left when you had the chance, it hissed, its voice distorted, warped. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut in front of me. I was trapped. The thing came closer, its steps deliberate and slow. I could feel the air growing thicker, suffocating. Every instinct in me screamed to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself was holding me in place, locking me into its deadly grip. The figure reached out for me, its long, gnarled fingers brushing my cheek. Cold. Like death itself. James, it whispered. You'll never leave. And that was when I understood. This house didn't just haunt the living, it consumed them. It twisted them into something else. Something that couldn't leave. I tried to scream, to run, but it was already too late. The last thing I remembered before the darkness swallowed me whole was the sound of Laura's voice calling out, faint and distant. James. James. And then, nothing. The ghostly railroad crossing in Georgia. I had just moved to Georgia. The town was small, quiet, almost too quiet, and I found myself feeling out of place. The house I rented was old, but nothing out of the ordinary. The town was charming, but there was something unsettling about the stillness here, like the air itself carried stories that no one spoke about. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched across the ground, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The path I chose led me through a small wooded area and onto a rural road that passed over a railroad track. It wasn't a particularly busy crossing, and the town's train station was several miles away. There was no reason for me to be here, except I felt drawn to it for reasons I couldn't explain. As I reached the crossing, I stopped. The air felt thicker here, the silence more profound. I looked around, nothing seemed out of place. Yet, there was a strange feeling in my chest, as though something were watching me. I tried to shake off the unease and was about to turn back when I heard it. A whistle. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it pierced the silence like a cold wind. I turned toward the tracks. The whistle came again, louder this time, followed by the distant rumble of a train. But there was no train in sight. I waited. My mind raced, trying to reason it out. Perhaps a train was coming from a hidden part of the track, I thought. The railroad wasn't used much these days, so it wasn't impossible that the train had been running late. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt something wasn't right. There was no sign of headlights. No sound of wheels scraping the rails. Yet the whistle persisted, growing louder, the rumble of the train becoming more pronounced. My curiosity pushed me to step closer to the crossing, my feet dragging through the overgrown grass. It was as if I were being pulled toward the sound, like it was calling to me. And then, in the growing dark, I saw it. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, a shimmer of light at first, small, like the reflection of a distant star. But as I watched, the light grew stronger. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. It wasn't the headlamp of a train, though it seemed to be coming from where the train should be. It was more like the outline of something, an illusion, maybe. A blur, a haze of movement where the train should be. I squinted into the darkness, my breathing shallow. I could almost see it now, an old-fashioned train with rusted metal and wooden cars that looked straight out of another time. The whistle sounded again, closer this time, and I took a step back. I couldn't explain it. The train was there, but it was also not there. The light flickered and then disappeared, leaving me standing alone in the fading twilight. I waited for a moment, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had seen. But the air was still. The whistle had stopped. There was no sign of the train. Nothing had moved. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. After all, I was new to this place, new to its strange history and unfamiliar with the old superstitions. Surely, there was an explanation. Maybe the tracks were just in disrepair, and the noise was the result of a malfunctioning signal. But deep down, a part of me knew it wasn't that simple. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. The whisper of the train. The whistle, soft but unmistakable. It echoed in the distance, as though it was waiting for me. Waiting for something. I paused for a moment before walking away, not daring to look back. The sun had fully set now, and the weight of the darkness seemed heavier somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there, watching. And that, for some reason, I had just crossed a threshold. A threshold that I couldn't uncross. I didn't know it yet, but the train wasn't finished with me. The days following my encounter at the railroad crossing were filled with an uneasy tension that I couldn't explain. I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind in the dark of evening. But every time I walked past the crossing, a part of me would tense up, waiting for that haunting whistle. And every time, nothing. The air would be still. The tracks would be empty. I thought about telling someone, but the townspeople were friendly, yet distant. They had lived here for generations, and they all seemed to have their own lives, their own stories. I wasn't sure they'd understand. Besides, I didn't want to be branded as the outsider who saw things that weren't there. So, I kept the experience to myself. But it was only a matter of time before the whispers of the ghostly train began to spread. I had heard vague mentions of it from a few locals. Casual comments about hearing whistles late at night or seeing strange lights near the tracks. But no one ever seemed to speak of it directly. It was as though everyone knew, yet no one acknowledged it, like a shared secret that no one wanted to bring to the surface. One evening, after dinner, I decided to take a walk again. I tried to push the unease from my mind to enjoy the stillness of the countryside. But as I walked down the familiar path toward the crossing, the feeling of being watched returned. It wasn't the same as before. This time, it was stronger, more deliberate. The air felt thicker, as if it were pressing down on me, and the trees that lined the road swayed even though there was no wind. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was waiting, something was just out of sight. I reached the crossing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was fading into hues of purple and orange, but the tracks remained shrouded in shadow. I stood at the edge, gazing down the rail, half expecting the glow from before. Nothing. I exhaled in relief, telling myself I was being foolish. The tracks were just tracks. A crossing was just a crossing. Then, it came again. A faint whistle. I froze, my blood running cold. This time, the sound was unmistakable. There was no wind, no car engines rumbling in the distance, only that eerie whistle, high-pitched and distant, but drawing nearer. I turned quickly, my heart racing. The light appeared again, just as it had before, at first a faint glow, then growing larger, like a dim, distant star. I stepped back, unable to look away. It was almost hypnotic, this pull toward the sound. And then, through the thickening fog, I saw it. The train. It was a train, but it wasn't right. It was old, worn, like a relic from another time. The cars were rickety, with rusted metal and wooden boards. The windows were fogged, the inside dark, yet I could feel eyes watching me from behind them. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. The train was moving slowly, creeping along the tracks, the whistle still rising in pitch. The sound of its wheels against the rails echoed through the air, deafening and haunting. But as the train drew nearer, I noticed something else. The passengers. They were there, in the windows. People, staring out into the night, their faces obscured by the shadows. But I could see their eyes, dark, hollow eyes that seemed to be fixed on me, unblinking, unmoving. They were waiting. Waiting for something, or perhaps someone. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. My mind raced. I knew what I was seeing wasn't real, couldn't be real. But the sound of the train, the feeling of it moving through the air, it was tangible. And the passengers. They weren't just figments of my imagination. Then, the whistle came again, even louder this time, cutting through the silence. I took a step back, ready to run. But the train wasn't slowing down. It was speeding up. I turned and started to walk quickly, trying to distance myself from it, but the air seemed to grow heavier, like the train was pushing down on me from behind. My footsteps quickened, and I dared not look back. I didn't hear the train any longer. It was gone, as if it had vanished into thin air. But the feeling of eyes watching me remained. I didn't know what to think. Was it a ghost? Was it a haunting? Or was I simply losing my mind, succumbing to the strangeness of this place? I didn't have answers, only more questions, and the certainty that I couldn't ignore this any longer. Something was wrong at that crossing. Something had happened there, and the train, the passengers, they weren't just a part of the past. They were trapped. And now, it seemed, I was too. The night after my encounter, I couldn't sleep. The image of those hollow eyes in the train's windows haunted me like a nightmare that refused to fade. I tossed and turned in bed, convinced that whatever I had witnessed wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It felt too real, too vivid. Something about the passengers, their lifeless stares, their unmoving forms, kept playing over and over in my mind. I had to know more. I needed answers. The next day, I ventured into town, my mind still unsettled by the events of the previous night. I hoped that maybe someone in town might offer an explanation, or at the very least, tell me I wasn't the only one to experience such strange occurrences. I found myself at the diner, a place where locals gathered to share coffee, gossip, and stories of the past. The place smelled of fried food and strong coffee, and the murmur of conversations filled the air. I chose a seat at the counter and waited for the waitress to approach. "Can I get you something?" she asked with a smile that seemed more out of habit than genuine cheerfulness. I hesitated, unsure how to approach the subject. "Actually," I said, lowering my voice slightly, "I wanted to ask about the railroad crossing just outside of town. The one down by the tracks." Her expression shifted slightly, just enough to show recognition. But she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "You've heard the stories, I take it," she said quietly, leaning in a little closer. "About the train." I nodded, relieved to hear someone else mention it. "Yes. I've seen it. I don't know what it is, but last night, She raised a hand to stop me, her eyes scanning the diner once more. "People around here don't talk much about it. Some things, it's better to leave alone. But what is it? Why is it there?" I pressed. She hesitated, then let out a long sigh. "There was an accident, years ago. A train derailed right there at the crossing. It was a terrible mess, too many lives lost. And ever since, well, the locals say the train, it still runs. At least, what's left of it does." I leaned in, my curiosity growing. "So the ghost train, it's real?" "Not exactly," she said softly, her voice dropping even lower. "It's more like a memory. The souls of those who died, they never left. They're stuck, waiting for something. Some say they're waiting for the train to complete its journey. Others say they're waiting for the people who caused the accident to come back and face them. But no one really knows. And no one wants to know." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "And the passengers? Do they ever appear in the windows?" she interrupted, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, they do. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that sometimes, if you're too close to the crossing when the train goes by, you can hear them, see them, as if they're still alive. And if you're not careful, they'll try to pull you onto the train with them. Some people say they've felt hands reaching for them, pulling them in. You don't want to get caught in that. My heart began to race. I had been standing at the crossing the night before, close enough to hear the whistle and see the train's ghostly presence. The thought that I might have been close to something even darker than I realized sent a chill through me. Has anyone ever disappeared? I asked, the question leaving my mouth before I could stop it. The waitress stared at me, her face unreadable. Not disappeared. But there are stories. People who never came back, or who came back, changed. I nodded, absorbing what I could. Thank you, I said, standing up. I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me. I needed to get out of there. I had to figure out what was going on, even if it meant confronting something that I couldn't quite understand. I left the diner, my mind racing. The ghostly train wasn't just a myth or an illusion, it was something more. Something trapped between the living and the dead. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't just witnessing a haunting. I was witnessing a curse, one that was tied to that crossing, to the people who had died there, and perhaps to me now as well. I decided to return to the crossing that evening. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Answers, perhaps. Or maybe I was just trying to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. As the sun began to set, I found myself back at the tracks. The air had grown heavier, thicker with the approaching night. There were no cars in sight, no sounds of movement, just the quiet hum of the world winding down. I stood there for a long while, staring down the tracks, half expecting to hear the familiar whistle again. But nothing came. The silence pressed in on me. Then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a train whistle, distant at first, then growing louder, coming closer, until it was all I could hear. And then, I saw it. The train, or what remained of it. The same rickety cars, the same fogged windows, and once again, the passengers, pale, lifeless, staring out at me. But this time, they weren't just waiting. This time, I felt them watching me, looking at me as if they knew I had seen them before. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the train disappeared into the fog, leaving me standing there, alone, with the weight of their eyes still on me. I stood there, my body frozen in place, long after the train had vanished into the mist. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing with the terrifying realization that I was no longer just a witness. I had become part of the story. The ghostly train wasn't a distant memory or a figment of imagination, it was a curse, and I had felt its pull. The world around me seemed to blur as if the reality I knew was beginning to unravel. The silence that followed was suffocating, oppressive. I tried to force my legs to move, to take a step, but something held me there, a weight that felt heavier than the air itself. I finally broke free from the trance and stumbled away from the tracks, heart pounding. My skin was cold, but it wasn't from the temperature, it was from the creeping dread that had taken hold of me. I knew that this wasn't over. Something worse was coming, and I had just begun to understand the consequences of my curiosity. I spent the next few days trying to shake off the experience, but every corner of my mind kept returning to the crossing, to the train, to the eyes of those passengers who had waited for so long. I went back to the diner, hoping to find more answers. The waitress wasn't there, but I spotted a man sitting in the corner, an older man with deep lines on his face, like someone who had lived through things that could never be fully understood. I felt drawn to him, like he might know something about the train, something that could help me make sense of what I was experiencing. I approached his table hesitantly, but he looked up at me as if he had been expecting me. "You're the one who saw it, aren't you?" His voice was rough, but there was an undeniable edge of recognition in it. I nodded, too afraid to speak. He leaned back in his chair, staring at me with eyes that seemed to look right through me. "It's not just a story," he said quietly. "It's real. That train, it's not just some old ghost. It's a cycle. A prison for those who died, and for anyone who dares to stand on that crossing." I sat down, my stomach twisting. "A cycle? A prison?" He nodded grimly. "The train isn't just repeating its route because of some glitch in the afterlife. The souls trapped in it are stuck, forever reliving the last moments of their lives. They can't move on. They're stuck in that loop, waiting for something to break it. But it never will. The only way to escape it is if someone new gets caught in the cycle." I felt a chill creep down my spine. "You're saying it's trying to pull me in?" The man met my gaze with a look of sorrow. "It doesn't care who it pulls in. It's been like this for years. Every now and then, someone comes along, someone who's curious or who's too close to the crossing. And they get dragged in, just like the rest of them. You've already seen it. You've already felt its pull." I shook my head, disbelief clouding my thoughts. "No. That can't be possible." "It's more than possible," he said with a voice like gravel. "I've seen it happen. I've heard their whispers, those passengers. They're still there, on that train. But no one ever gets out. They never get to leave. It's a damnation." I sat in stunned silence, processing his words. The weight of his confession felt like a cold hand wrapping around my heart. "You don't have much time," he added, his voice low and serious. "The longer you stay near the crossing, the harder it will be to get away. The train is patient. It doesn't rush. But when it wants you, it will come for you. And once it does, you'll be just another shadow on its tracks, waiting for the next curious soul to come along." A heavy silence settled between us. I wanted to say something, ask more questions, but I couldn't bring myself to. The terror had set in deep, and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. The man had spoken the truth, and every part of me knew it. I had to get away. I had to leave Georgia, leave that cursed crossing behind me. But even as I thought it, a new sense of dread gripped me. The train was still out there, waiting, watching. That night, I decided to confront it one last time. I had to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't being consumed by fear. I drove back to the crossing under the cover of darkness, my hands tight on the steering wheel. The air was thick, heavy with the sense of something lurking just out of sight. The highway was empty, the world around me eerily still. As I parked near the crossing, I glanced out over the tracks, the beams of my headlights cutting through the fog. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world was still, the only sound the soft hum of the engine. Then, I heard it. The unmistakable whistle of the train, faint at first, then growing louder until it filled the air around me. The same sound, the same chill running through my veins. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. The train was coming. I turned my head, my heart hammering in my chest, and there it was. The ghostly train appearing out of the mist. The lights flickered dimly, casting shadows on the ground. And through the windows, I saw them again. The passengers. The faces of the lost souls, their eyes empty, their bodies unmoving. But this time, there was something different. Something that made the blood freeze in my veins. The train wasn't passing by anymore. It was stopping. The doors of the train opened slowly, and one by one, the figures began to step out. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and their eyes were all fixed on me. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. The whispers of the passengers reached my ears, their voices distant yet clear. "Come with us," they murmured. "Come and never leave." I turned to run, but it was too late. I felt my legs give way beneath me as the cold fingers of fear wrapped themselves around my spine. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with promises I didn't want to hear, urging me to step forward. The faces of the passengers were closer now, their pale, hollow eyes locked onto mine, their mouths forming words I couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. They wanted me. I stumbled back, panic surging through me, but no matter how hard I tried to move, it was like something was holding me in place. My body refused to obey, as if the very air had thickened into something viscous, paralyzing me. The train's doors creaked open wider, and the figures began to disembark, slowly walking towards me. I could feel them, feel the weight of their endless, tortured existence pressing against me. They moved without sound, their feet never touching the ground, as though they were floating just above the earth. Each one of them had a story. Each one had a life, and now they had only one mission: to add me to their eternal procession. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came from my throat. My vision blurred, and I felt the world around me start to warp. The air grew colder, sharper, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. A voice, low and raspy, echoed through my mind, as if it were coming from all around me. "You will never escape." The words were a promise, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't a threat, it was a fact. The first passenger reached me, a woman dressed in an old-fashioned dress, her face a mask of grief and despair. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, bore into mine, and I could see the flicker of recognition in them, recognition of what I was about to become. A shadow, an echo, lost in a cycle that never ended. Her fingers reached for me, and I felt a jolt of icy terror shoot through my body as her cold touch grazed my arm. A wave of dread crashed over me, more intense than anything I had ever known. Her touch felt like it was burning me, pulling me into the train's eternal loop. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the grip of the spirits who had long ago given up their place in the world of the living. I could feel them all around me now, their eyes watching, their whispers growing louder. "Come with us," they whispered in unison, their voices soft, hypnotic, but full of an unshakable finality. And then I understood. There was no escape. The train wasn't just a ghost, it was the vehicle of souls, forever bound to the tracks, to repeat their final journey again and again. And I, foolishly, had become one of them. The woman's hand wrapped around mine, cold as death itself, and I felt myself being pulled toward the open door of the train, the other passengers stepping aside as if to welcome me into their endless procession. I tried to fight back, tried to pull away, but the force was too strong. My body moved on its own, obeying the will of the spirits that had ensnared me. The train's doors slammed shut behind me, and the world outside began to blur, the fog swallowing everything in its path. And then, just like that, the train began to move. The tracks beneath it creaked as it started to gain speed, the whistle sounding once again, this time not in the distance, but directly above us, echoing through the claustrophobic space of the train. The passengers around me, faces devoid of hope, stared forward as if they had already accepted their fate. There was no talking, no crying, just the slow, inevitable march of time as the train carried us through a world that was no longer real. I wanted to scream, but there was nothing left in me. The finality of it all, the impossibility of escape, settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I could still feel the ground, but it was as though I was no longer touching it. My body was weightless, and I was nothing more than a shadow among shadows. The train raced through the night, through the mist, through time itself. I had become part of its endless journey, part of the ghostly parade that would never end, no matter how many times I tried to escape. The world outside was a blur, but I knew, deep in my soul, that I was now one of them. One of the lost souls, bound to the tracks, forever riding the rails. The fog outside thickened, and as we hurtled into the darkness, I saw what lay ahead, another crossing. Another moment in time that would be forever the same. And I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that I would never leave. The cursed library in Illinois. It started innocently enough. I had recently moved to a small town in Illinois, and like any newcomer, I was eager to explore. On one particularly quiet afternoon, I stumbled upon an old, almost forgotten library at the edge of town. It wasn't the most inviting building, its wooden exterior darkened with age and the windows covered in a layer of grime. But something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the allure of its history, or maybe just the sheer quiet of the place. I decided to enter. The moment I crossed the threshold, a chill swept over me. It wasn't the kind of chill that makes you shiver. It was heavier, deeper, as though the very air inside was different. I brushed it off as the natural coolness of the stone building, but as I wandered deeper into the library, I began to feel an unsettling presence. The place was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of pages, though no one was around. I wandered between rows of dusty shelves, the scent of old paper and wood permeating the air. It was the kind of place that felt stuck in time. As I browsed through the books, my fingers grazing their worn spines, I noticed something strange. There were certain sections of the library that seemed off, darker somehow. The shelves here were more densely packed, and the air felt heavier. I couldn't help but be drawn to one of the shelves. It stood in the far corner of the library, where the light barely reached, casting long shadows. The books on this shelf seemed older than the others, their covers cracked and pages yellowed with age. I pulled one of them from the shelf, a thick tome, bound in dark leather, with no title on the spine. The moment I touched it, I felt a jolt, as if an electric shock had run through my fingertips. I was about to open the book when a voice, faint at first, brushed against my ear. "Put it down." I froze. The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it felt as though it had come from directly behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly spun around. The library was still empty, the silence pressing down on me with suffocating weight. I told myself it was just my imagination, the quiet playing tricks on me. I returned the book to the shelf and quickly moved away. But the whisper followed me. It was subtle, like a faint breeze, brushing against the back of my neck, but I could feel it. Someone, or something, was watching me. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it persisted, gnawing at me with each step. I walked deeper into the library, hoping the unease would subside. But it only intensified as I reached another row of bookshelves. This time, I noticed something else. Shadows. They weren't right, too fluid, too deep, like they were moving on their own, stretching toward me as I walked past. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows seemed to twist, as if they were alive, following my every movement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I hurried to the next aisle, trying to escape the sensation of being pursued. But the whispers, they kept coming. Leave, now! I turned a corner, and for the briefest moment, I saw a figure at the end of the aisle, a tall, dark silhouette standing motionless, its features obscured in shadow. It was a person, but not a person. The figure had no distinct features, just a dark outline that seemed to melt into the surroundings. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, staring at the figure. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its unblinking gaze fixed on me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The figure slowly began to dissolve into the air, its shape distorting, as if it was never truly there at all. The shadows in the library shifted, and the room suddenly felt smaller, more oppressive. My head spun, the air felt thick, and the walls seemed to close in on me. The whispering voices escalated, overlapping each other until they became a cacophony of murmurs. "Don't touch the books." I staggered backward, my heart racing, the world around me spinning. It was as though the very air in the library had come alive, its oppressive weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had to leave. Turning on my heel, I rushed toward the exit, but as I passed the rows of books, I heard a soft, mournful cry. It was coming from one of the shelves, a sound so full of sorrow that it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't look back. The door slammed behind me as I rushed out into the daylight, gasping for air. I stood outside for a long moment, trying to steady my breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, wouldn't leave me. The whispering voices still echoed in my mind, urging me to stay away from the books, from the cursed library. I didn't know what I had felt inside that place, but one thing was clear: I would never step foot inside that library again. But I had no idea that my visit was just the beginning. The curse of the library had begun to follow me. It had been 3 days since I left the library, and yet every night the same feeling crept over me like an unwelcome shadow. The whispers, the figures, the chill in the air, it all lingered in the back of my mind, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. I tried to push it all out of my thoughts, distracting myself with mundane tasks, but something was drawing me back. I couldn't explain it, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows from the library shifting and stretching in the corners of my vision. That evening, after a restless night, I found myself standing at the edge of the library again. I hadn't planned to return, not consciously, but my feet had brought me there. The old stone building stood before me like a forgotten relic, its windows dark and foreboding. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the door. The weight of what had happened inside that library pressed down on me, but something inside urged me to go in. It felt like a decision made for me, as though I was being pulled by invisible strings. I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges sounding louder than I remembered. The air inside was cooler than before, and the smell of old paper and dust filled my lungs. At first, it seemed quiet, too quiet. But soon, I could hear it again, the faint rustle of pages turning, the almost imperceptible whispering that seemed to swirl around the shelves, just out of reach. I hesitated. Something about the air felt wrong, thicker than before. My skin prickled with unease. But the whispers, the call, it was almost impossible to ignore. "Come closer," they urged. I could feel the shadows moving again, stretching like dark tendrils, wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the heart of the library. The flickering overhead lights created strange patterns on the walls, and I couldn't help but follow the path they seemed to form. It led me down the same aisles, past the same rows of books. And then, I saw it, the shelf in the corner, where I had found the forbidden book just days before. It was waiting for me, its shadowy presence calling out to me. The books on that shelf seemed different this time. They were no longer just old or dusty. Now, they looked alive, pulse-like, as if something inside them was stirring. The air around the shelf felt heavier, almost suffocating. I walked toward it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. "Take it," they hissed. "Open it." I stood before the shelf, feeling as though the books themselves were watching me, waiting for me to choose. My fingers trembled as I reached out for one of the tomes, the thick leather cover cooled to the touch. The moment my hand made contact, the temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in invisible clouds, and I could hear the soft whispering again, closer now, like a presence standing just behind me. "Don't open it." The voice was louder this time, more desperate. I froze, my fingers hovering over the book. The shadows around me seemed to shift again, swirling faster, becoming more intense, as though the very space itself was closing in. I couldn't understand why, but I felt as though the book had already taken hold of me, pulling me toward it. It wasn't a physical force, but something far worse, an invisible grip, sinking deep into my soul. It wanted to be opened. It wanted to be read. But then I heard something that made me recoil. A voice, not a whisper but a scream, a loud, anguished cry of someone trapped within the walls of the library. It came from the shadows, distant but piercing. The books trembled on their shelves, as though the sound had shaken them awake. I backed away from the shelf, my mind screaming for me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls tightening, the lights flickering in a violent rhythm. The whispering was now a chorus of voices, some pleading, some warning, some demanding. "You're not supposed to be here." A figure materialized in the distance, its outline obscured in shadow. It was tall enough to scrape the ceiling, with no clear features, just an oppressive darkness. The figure moved slowly toward me, and with each step, the temperature seemed to drop further, until I was shivering uncontrollably. "Leave. Now." The words were clear this time, not a whisper but a command. I turned, desperate to escape, but the aisles had changed. What had once been familiar now felt alien, disorienting. The shadows seemed to shift at will, blocking my way, leading me deeper into the labyrinth of shelves. I could hear footsteps now, slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone, or something, was following me. I felt it at my back, but when I turned, no one was there. "You cannot leave," the voice whispered, closer than before. I sprinted down the aisles, my breath ragged, my mind clouded with fear. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace, growing louder with each step. The shelves blurred past me as I turned corner after corner, only to find myself back where I started. The same shelf, the same books, the same shadows, stretching toward me. "You will never leave." I turned to face the figure behind me once more, and this time, its outline was clearer. It was a woman, though her face was hidden beneath a black veil of shadows. Her outstretched hand reached for me, the fingers long and skeletal, her grip cold enough to freeze my very soul. I screamed, but no sound came out. The world around me seemed to twist and warp, the shadows growing darker, the library closing in. And then, all at once, everything went silent. The presence was gone. But I was no longer alone. The library was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong choice again. As I stood frozen in place, I realized the terrifying truth: I was never meant to leave. The curse of the library had already claimed me. I couldn't move. My body felt like it had turned to stone, weighed down by the oppressive silence. The air was thick, suffocating with a presence that I could not see, but I could feel in every corner of the room. The shadows were no longer just dark shapes on the wall. They had become something alive, watchful, waiting. I could almost hear their slow, rhythmic pulse, like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something. The library was no longer just a place. It was a prison. The thought made my heart race. I was trapped. I tried to remember how I had entered, how I had wandered down the aisles so freely, but now everything seemed so distant. The shelves, the books, nothing was familiar. The once comforting smell of old paper had turned into something rotten, a faint stench of decay that I couldn't shake from my nose. I tried to move, but it was as though my feet were cemented to the floor. The shadows seemed to stretch around me, curling and twisting, blocking my way. I reached for the nearest shelf, desperate for something to hold on to, but my hand passed straight through the books. They were not real, just empty spaces, like illusions. Leave. The voice whispered again, a hollow echo that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was the woman, the one with the veil of shadows. She was closer now. I could feel it in the air, her presence pressing down on me like a weight that threatened to crush me. Her voice was clear, but distant, as if coming from the very walls themselves. You are not meant to read these books. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move, to break free of the paralysis that held me in place. I staggered forward, taking one shaky step after another, but the path ahead was nothing more than a blur of darkness. The aisles twisted and bent in unnatural ways, leading me nowhere, taking me back to where I started. Every time I thought I had found a way out, I ended up facing the same shelf, the same row of cursed books. I could hear the sound of footsteps again, slow, deliberate, but always just out of reach. It wasn't her, not yet, but something else. Something worse. They're here. They are watching. The whisper was louder now, more insistent, like a chorus of voices layered over one another, coming from all directions. The walls seemed to close in around me, their shadows moving like tendrils reaching for me. And then I saw them, shapes, flickering at the edges of my vision, darting in and out of the darkness. They weren't human, not really. Figures in dark robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their eyes empty holes of shadow. They were the Watchers, the ones who guarded the cursed books. You will never leave, one of them said, its voice deep and hollow, vibrating through my bones. I ran. There was no plan, no direction, only the frantic need to escape. But the library was no longer just a building. It had become something sentient, alive with a hunger that seemed to stretch out and consume the very air I breathed. Every step I took felt like it brought me deeper into its maw. I had to get out. I had to. But the library was closing in on me. No one leaves, the voice growled, as the shadows around me seemed to come to life. They grew, towering over me, swallowing the light. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an unholy energy, vibrating with a life of their own. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to ripple, as though the library itself was a living, breathing entity. I stumbled, my knees giving out beneath me, and fell to the floor. The shadows were everywhere now, curling around me, whispering in voices I couldn't understand. My breath came in sharp gasps, my heart pounding in my chest as I scrambled to push myself up. But as I reached for the ground, my fingers brushed something cold and slick. I froze. A book. It was an ancient tome, its leather cover cracked and worn. I hadn't seen it before. It was not like the others. This one was different. The spine was etched with symbols I couldn't recognize, the edges of the pages tinged with a dark stain. It was as though the book had been waiting for me, beckoning me to open it. I recoiled, instinctively pulling my hand away. I had learned my lesson. The curse of the library was in the books, and I knew better than to open one. But it was too late. Before I could move, a low, guttural laugh filled the air, a sound that made my skin crawl. It came from everywhere at once, surrounding me, pressing down on me. "You think you can leave?" the voice sneered. "You're already part of this place. You belong to us now." The temperature in the room dropped. My breath turned to fog in front of me, and I could feel the cold seep into my bones. The air thickened, and I saw the shapes, more of them now, crowding around me, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were the spirits of the library, bound to the cursed books, never able to escape. They had once been readers, like me, but they had opened the wrong book. Now, they were trapped. "You will join us." The book in my hands trembled, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving inside the pages. Something alive. But it was too fast, too fleeting, and when I blinked, it was gone. I felt the pressure around me increase, the voices, the eyes, all of them closing in on me. There was no escape. The library was everywhere. The spirits, the watchers, they were all around me. I had become one of them. And just as I thought I had reached the point of no return, the book snapped open, its pages turning by an unseen hand. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. The curse had claimed me. And now, I would never leave. I don't know how much time passed after the book opened. My mind felt foggy, detached, like I was floating in some endless void. The air was suffocating, thick with the smell of dust and decay. The shadows pressed in on me, wrapping around my body like invisible chains, and I felt myself being pulled into the pages of the book. The text inside was strange, its words shifting and changing before my eyes, as though they were alive, breathing. At first, the letters were just symbols, meaningless to me, but then they began to form words, sentences that seemed to speak directly to my soul. They whispered promises, threats, and warnings. "You are one of us now," the words echoed, each one sinking into my skin like needles, cold and sharp. "You will stay here, bound to the library forever." My heartbeat quickened. I tried to close the book, to slam it shut, but it wouldn't budge. The pages wouldn't stop turning. The book had a life of its own. And the deeper I looked into the pages, the more I saw shadows, faces, hands reaching out for me, pulling me in. The whispers grew louder. I could hear them in my mind, in the walls, in the air around me. "You cannot escape." The room was no longer just a library. It had transformed, become something darker, more twisted. The walls seemed to writhe and shift, as though they were made of living flesh. The shelves were now tall and menacing, their weight groaning under the weight of countless tomes, books that had once been filled with knowledge, now corrupted by the presence of the spirits that haunted them. I looked up, trying to make sense of what was happening, and that's when I saw them. The figures. They were no longer just shadows. They were real, tangible, ghosts of those who had dared to read from the cursed shelves before me. They stood in front of me, their eyes hollow and empty, their faces frozen in silent screams. They were the ones who had opened the wrong books, the ones who had become part of the library's cursed collection. And now, they were waiting for me to join them. "There is no escape," one of them said, its voice like gravel, scraping against my nerves. "The library is our prison. And now it is yours, too." Panic surged through me. My heart pounded against my chest, and my hands shook as I dropped the book. It fell to the floor with a hollow thud, the pages still flipping by themselves, the whispers intensifying. I had to get out. But how? The door was nowhere to be seen, and every direction I turned only led to more of the same, a maze of endless rows of books, their spines covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and pulse in the dark. The figures were getting closer, their forms flickering like candle flames in a storm. I could hear their footsteps now, dragging along the floor, slow and deliberate. They were closing in. "You cannot fight it," they chanted, their voices blending together, becoming one unholy chorus. "You are already part of this place." I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs moved on their own. I stumbled through the aisles, my breath ragged, my pulse racing. The shadows followed me, pressing in on all sides, their whispers louder, more insistent. I could feel them, their cold hands reaching out, trying to grab me, to pull me into the dark. But I kept running. I couldn't let them take me. Not like this. Not while I still had a chance. I turned a corner, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw light. A soft, warm glow, like the flickering of a distant lantern. My hope surged, but just as quickly, it was crushed. The light wasn't real. It was another trick, another illusion of the library to lure me into a trap. I skidded to a stop. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned to face the shadows behind me. They were everywhere now, their shapes shifting and melding together, forming a sea of darkness that swallowed everything in its path. "You cannot run from the library," a voice hissed, low and menacing. "You belong here, just like the rest of us." I backed up, stumbling as I tried to turn around and find a way out. My eyes were wide with terror, my body shaking uncontrollably. And then I saw it. A door. It was small, hidden behind a row of bookshelves that seemed to shift while I wasn't looking directly at them. But I knew this was my chance. I had to reach it. Without thinking, I ran toward the door, my hands reaching for the handle. But before I could touch it, a force slammed into me, cold, unrelenting. I was thrown backward, my body crashing into the floor. I couldn't breathe. The shadows closed in, and the voices grew louder, their words crashing against my mind like waves on a shore. I was drowning in their whispers, suffocating under their weight. "You cannot leave," the voice of a woman, the one who had been watching me since the beginning, echoed in my head. "This is where you will stay. Forever." I could feel the cold creeping into my skin, into my bones, and I knew deep down that I wasn't going to make it. There was no escape. The library had claimed me. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the soft, eerie whisper of the pages turning. And then, silence. The library was silent once more, the whispers fading into nothingness. The shelves stood like sentinels, guarding the cursed books that lay within. And somewhere, in the deepest corner of the room, a new book began to turn its pages, as another soul was bound forever to the library. And I was one of them now. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.